She was 15 years old, the daughter of a judge, raised in a home where the law was sacred. But on the night her parents tried to send her away, Ivy Vale made a decision that would destroy everything. She shot her mother in the kitchen. She shot her father in the hallway, and then she walked upstairs to her little brother's bedroom. When the police arrived, she told them a masked stranger had broken in. She cried, she trembled, she played the victim perfectly. But one camera across the street had captured the truth, and the truth does not forget. Stories like this remind us that justice always finds its way. If you believe in accountability, subscribe now and share your thoughts below. This is how it all began. Belmere, Mississippi was the kind of town where everyone knew the judge. Adrienne Vale had served on the bench for 20 years. He believed in rules. He believed in consequences. His wife Elena believed in second chances. She was patient, warm, and devoted to her children. Their son Noah was 9 years old. He loved dinosaurs and bedtime stories. Their daughter Ivy was 15, smart, quiet, watching everything. For years, she had been the golden child. But behind closed doors, something inside her had started to rot, and no one noticed until it was far too late. The call came in at 12 minutes past midnight. A teenage girl's voice filled the dispatch recording. She was crying. She was whispering. She said someone had broken into her home. She said her parents were not moving. She said there was blood everywhere. The dispatcher told her to stay calm. The dispatcher told her to hide. The dispatcher told her help was coming. But something about the girl's voice did not sound right. Her breathing was too controlled. Her words were too rehearsed. And when officers arrived at the Vale residence on Oakmont Lane, they found something far worse than a home invasion. They found a massacre dressed up like a tragedy. The first officer through the door was Deputy Marcus Trent. He had worked in Belmere for 11 years. He had seen car accidents. He had seen bar fights. He had seen one drowning at the lake that still gave him nightmares. But he had never seen anything like what waited inside the Vale home that night. The smell hit him first, copper and gunpowder and something else he could not name. The lights were on in the kitchen. The television was playing softly in the living room, and in the hallway between those two spaces lay the body of Judge Adrienne Vale. His eyes were open, his chest was still. A pool of dark red had spread beneath him like a shadow that refused to fade. Deputy Trent called for backup. He called for paramedics. He called for anyone who could help him make sense of what he was seeing. Then he moved deeper into the house. In the kitchen, he found Elena Vale. She was lying near the island. Her hand was reaching toward the doorway, as if she had tried to crawl toward her husband. A single gunshot wound marked her torso. The medical examiner would later determine she had lived for several minutes after being shot. Several minutes of knowing. Several minutes of hoping someone would come. No one came in time. The house had been quiet. The neighbors had heard nothing. And the girl who called 911 had been upstairs the entire time. Her name was Ivy, 15 years old, sophomore at Belmere High School, daughter of the most respected judge in the county. When Deputy Trent found her, she was sitting on the stairs. Her knees were pulled to her chest. Her arms were wrapped around herself. She looked small. She looked fragile. She looked like a child who had just witnessed something no child should ever witness. But her eyes were dry, her voice was steady, and when she spoke, she did not ask about her mother. She did not ask about her father. She asked when she could have her phone back. That question would haunt the investigators for weeks. It would be mentioned in depositions. It would be repeated in court. And it would become one of the many small details that revealed the truth hiding beneath the surface. Because Ivy Vale was not a victim. She was not a survivor. She was something else entirely, something that wore a daughter's face but had lost the capacity to feel what a daughter should feel, something that could stand in a house full of bodies and worry about a device instead of the dead. The crime scene technicians arrived within the hour. They photographed everything, the blood patterns, the shell casings, the broken window in the basement, the unlocked back door. At first glance, it looked like a home invasion gone wrong. A stranger had entered. A stranger had killed. A stranger had fled into the night. That was the story Ivy told. That was the story the town wanted to believe, because the alternative was too horrible. And the alternative meant that evil had not come from outside. It had grown right here, in this beautiful house, in this perfect family, in the heart of a girl who had once played piano at church recitals. But evidence does not care about what people want to believe. Evidence only tells the truth. And the truth began to emerge in small pieces. The broken window had glass on the wrong side. Someone had punched it out from inside the house, not from outside. The back door showed no signs of forced entry. The lock was intact. The frame was undamaged. If an intruder had come through that door, they had either picked the lock with surgical precision or they had used a key. Neither scenario made sense for a random break-in. Neither scenario matched the chaos of a violent home invasion. Then there was the matter of the gun. Judge Adrienne Vale kept a registered handgun in his home office. A 9mm Glock stored in a small safe beside his desk. The safe required a 4-digit code. Adrienne had chosen the numbers carefully. His wedding anniversary, a date only family members would know. When officers checked the safe, they found it empty. The gun was gone. And according to the manufacturer records, that gun matched the caliber of the bullets that had killed Elena and Adrienne Vale. Someone with access to the code had opened that safe. Someone who lived in this house. Ivy maintained her story throughout the night. She said she had been in her bedroom when she heard loud noises downstairs. She said she had hidden in her closet and called 911. She said she had not seen the intruder's face. She said he was tall. He was wearing dark clothes. And he had moved quickly and left through the back. Her account was detailed enough to sound credible. But it was also generic enough to raise suspicion. She described a suspect from a television script, not from a traumatic memory. Real witnesses remember strange details. The color of shoelaces, the sound of breathing, the smell of cologne. Ivy remembered only the outline of a monster that did not exist. By 2 a.m, the lead detective had arrived. Her name was Carla Mendez. She had transferred to Belmere from Jackson 3 years earlier. She had worked homicides in the city. She had seen parents kill children and children kill parents. She had learned to trust evidence over emotion. And from the moment she stepped into the Vale home, she felt something was wrong. The staging was too clean. The survivor was too calm. The story was too convenient. Carla did not say any of this out loud. She simply watched. She listened. She waited for the cracks to show. They found Noah an hour later. The 9-year-old boy was in his bedroom on the 2nd floor. He was lying in his bed beneath a dinosaur blanket his mother had bought him for his birthday. His nightlight was still glowing. His stuffed triceratops was still tucked under his arm. He looked peaceful. He looked like he was sleeping. But he was not sleeping. He would never wake up again. The bullet had entered while he lay there, trusting the darkness, trusting his family, trusting the sister who had read him bedtime stories and promised to protect him from bad dreams. Deputy Trent had to leave the room. He stood in the hallway and pressed his palms against his eyes and tried to breathe. And he had a son the same age. He had read that same dinosaur book 100 times. He could not stop imagining his own boy in that bed, his own boy with that same stillness. Carla Mendez stayed. She documented the scene with steady hands. She noted the position of the body. She noted the trajectory of the wound. She noted that the door had been opened from the outside. Someone had entered this room on purpose. Someone had made a choice, and that someone had not been a stranger. The sun rose over Belmere at 6:14 that morning. Golden light spread across the town square. Birds sang in the oak trees near the courthouse. Shopkeepers unlocked their doors and waved to neighbors and talked about the weather. None of them knew yet. None of them understood that their world had already changed. By noon, the news would spread. Or by evening, the cameras would arrive. By nightfall, Belmere would become a name the nation recognized. But in those early hours, there was still silence, still peace, still the illusion that this was a safe place where nothing truly terrible could happen. At the police station, Ivy Vale sat in a small interview room. She had been given a blanket. She had been given water. She had been told she was not under arrest. She was a witness, a survivor, a child who needed support. Carla Mendez sat across from her and asked gentle questions. Where were you when it started? What did you hear? What did you see? Ivy answered each one with the same measured tone. She did not stumble. She did not contradict herself. She performed grief like someone who had studied it from the outside. But there was one question she could not answer. One detail that did not fit her story. The medical examiner estimated that Elena had been shot first, then Adrienne, then Noah. The timeline suggested at least 15 minutes between the first shot and the last. 15 minutes during which Ivy claimed to be hiding in her closet, calling for help. But the 911 recording lasted only 4 minutes, and the call had come after all 3 victims were already dead. So what had Ivy been doing for those other 11 minutes? What had she been doing while her family bled out one by one? The question hung in the air like smoke. Carla did not push. Not yet. She simply wrote it down. She added it to the list of inconsistencies that was growing longer by the hour. The broken window, the missing gun, the timeline gap, the calm demeanor, the dry eyes, the question about the phone. Each detail alone meant nothing. But together they formed a pattern that pointed not toward an unknown intruder, but toward the only person in that house who had survived the night. Ivy asked to go home. She asked when the investigation would be over. She asked if she could stay with her aunt instead of going to foster care. She was already thinking about the future, already planning her next steps, already imagining a life beyond this room and this moment and this night. She did not ask about funerals. She did not ask about her brother's favorite toys or her mother's wedding ring. She did not ask anything that a grieving child would ask. And Carla Mendez noticed. Carla Mendez always noticed. Outside the station, the first reporters had begun to gather. They had heard about the judge. They had heard about the family. They had heard about the sole survivor, a 15-year-old girl who had hidden from a killer and lived to tell the story. It was the kind of narrative that sold papers and generated clicks and made people feel afraid and grateful at the same time. Afraid because it could happen to anyone. Grateful because it had not happened to them. But the reporters did not know the truth yet. They did not know that the killer had not hidden from Ivy. The killer was Ivy. And the proof was already waiting in the digital shadows she thought she had erased. Belmere. Mississippi was a town that believed in appearances. It had a courthouse with white columns and a bronze eagle on the roof. It had a main street lined with antique shops and family restaurants and a bakery that had been run by the same family for 4 generations. It had churches on every corner and football games every Friday night, and a sense of community that made outsiders feel both welcome and watched. In Belmere, people knew their neighbors. They attended the same schools and married into the same families and buried their dead in the same cemetery on the hill. It was a place where reputation mattered, where scandal was whispered, not shouted, where the worst thing you could do was embarrass your family in public. The Vale family had lived in Belmere for 3 generations. Adrienne's grandfather had been a circuit court judge in the 1950s. Adrienne's father had been a prosecutor before retiring to teach law at the community college. And Adrienne himself had taken the bench at 32 years old. He was the youngest judge in county history. He was also the most respected. He presided over civil disputes and custody battles and small claims that meant everything to the people involved. He was known for his fairness, his patience, his ability to explain complicated legal concepts in simple terms. When Adrienne Vale spoke, people listened. When Adrienne Vale ruled, people accepted. He was the closest thing Belmere had to royalty. Elena had come from outside. She had grown up in Memphis. She had studied nursing. She had met Adrienne at a conference when she was 23 and he was 29. Their courtship was brief and passionate and certain. Within a year, they were married. Within 2 years, they had Ivy. Elena gave up her nursing career to raise their daughter. She volunteered at the school library. She organized charity drives for the hospital. She baked casseroles for new mothers and sat with widows and remembered every birthday and anniversary in her address book. She was the kind of woman other women admired and occasionally resented. Too perfect, too patient, too devoted. But those who knew her well understood that her kindness was genuine. Elena truly believed in the goodness of people, even when evidence suggested otherwise. Noah arrived 9 years after Ivy. He was what Elena called her surprise blessing. A late pregnancy that doctors had warned might be difficult. But Noah came into the world healthy and happy and full of wonder. He had Adrienne's serious eyes and Elena's warm smile. He loved dinosaurs and science experiments and asking questions that had no easy answers. He followed his sister everywhere until she grew old enough to find him annoying. He left notes on her door and saved her the blue popsicles and believed with absolute certainty that Ivy was the coolest person in the world. He did not understand that she had stopped seeing him as a brother. He did not understand that she had started seeing him as an obstacle. The house on Oakmont Lane was exactly what you would expect a judge's family to live in. 2 stories, red brick, white shutters, a wraparound porch with rocking chairs and hanging ferns, a backyard with a swing set Noah still used, and a garden Elena tended every spring. Inside there were framed diplomas and family photographs and shelves full of leather-bound legal volumes Adrienne had inherited from his father. The kitchen had granite countertops and a farmhouse sink. The living room had a fireplace they lit every Christmas Eve. The dining room had a table that seated 12 because Elena believed in hosting, in gathering, in bringing people together around food and conversation. But no house is as perfect as it appears. No family is as happy as their photographs suggest. And behind the white shutters and the hanging ferns, something had begun to shift. It started small. So small that Adrienne and Elena did not notice at first. Ivy became secretive. She started locking her bedroom door. She started wearing headphones at dinner. She started answering questions with single syllables and sighs. Adrienne assumed it was normal teenage behavior. Elena assumed it was hormones and peer pressure and the stress of high school. They had read the parenting books. They knew adolescence was difficult. They believed that patience and consistency would carry their daughter through. They were wrong. Ivy's teachers began sending notes home. She was brilliant but distracted. She turned in assignments late or not at all. She argued with authority figures. She mocked classmates who tried to befriend her. One teacher described her as charming when she wanted something and cruel when she did not. Another teacher said she had never met a student so skilled at manipulation. The word made Adrienne uncomfortable. Manipulation was something criminals did, something defendants did when they lied on the witness stand. It was not something his daughter did. He refused to see the pattern. He focused on her grades instead. As long as she passed her classes, everything would be fine. Elena saw more than Adrienne allowed himself to see. She noticed that Ivy could cry on command. She noticed that apologies never came with changed behavior. She noticed that Ivy watched people the way a scientist watches specimens, calculating, measuring, deciding what approach would get her what she wanted. Elena tried to talk to Adrienne about it. She suggested counseling. She suggested psychiatric evaluation. She suggested that something deeper might be wrong. But Adrienne was a man who believed in logic and evidence and rational explanations. He did not believe his daughter was sick. He believed his daughter was spoiled, and he believed that discipline would fix what indulgence had broken. The conflict between them grew. Elena wanted intervention. Adrienne wanted restriction. Neither approach worked because neither addressed the truth. The truth was that Ivy did not care about their rules, or their love, or their expectations. She cared only about herself. She cared about what she wanted, and how to get it, and what stood in her way. Her parents were not people to her anymore. They were obstacles, authorities who controlled her phone, and her curfew, and her freedom. Enemies who needed to be managed until she was old enough to escape. In the months before the murders, Ivy had been caught in a series of lies. She told her parents she was at a friend's house when she was actually at a party. She told her teachers she was sick when she was actually skipping class. She created fake social media accounts to talk to people her parents had forbidden her to contact. She stole prescription medication from Elena's bathroom cabinet and sold it at school. She started dating someone older, someone her parents did not know about, someone who encouraged her worst impulses and told her she deserved better than the life her family had given her. When Adrienne discovered the medication theft, he did something he had never done before. He searched Ivy's room. He found the burner phone. He found the messages. He found evidence of a double life that shocked him to his core. His daughter was not rebellious. She was predatory. She had been lying to them for months, maybe years. She had become someone he did not recognize, someone he feared. For the first time, Adrienne Vale looked at his child and saw a stranger looking back. The confrontation happened 3 days before the murders. Adrienne called a family meeting. He laid out the evidence. He told Ivy that she would be enrolled in a therapeutic boarding program. She would leave Belmere. She would receive treatment. She would not return until professionals determined she was ready. It was the hardest decision he had ever made, but he believed it was the right one. He believed he was saving his daughter from herself. Ivy did not scream. She did not cry. She did not beg. She simply listened. She nodded at the appropriate moments. She said she understood. She said she was sorry. She said she would cooperate. And then she went to her room and closed the door and began to plan. Because Ivy Vale did not accept consequences. She did not accept losing control. She did not accept being sent away like a problem to be solved. If her parents wanted a war, she would give them one. And she would make sure they could never send her anywhere ever again. Elena came to her room that night. She sat on the edge of the bed and tried one last time to reach her daughter. She said that love was not the same as approval. She said that help was not the same as punishment. She said that no matter what Ivy had done, the door was still open. The relationship could still heal. Forgiveness was still possible. But only if Ivy chose it. Only if she stopped lying. Only if she let them in. Ivy hugged her mother. She whispered that she loved her. She promised to do better. She watched Elena leave with tears in her eyes, and then she returned to her phone. She returned to her plans. She returned to the cold calculation that had replaced whatever warmth she once possessed. Her mother had given her 48 more hours of freedom. 48 hours to figure out how to stop what was coming. 48 hours to decide who would live and who would die. Noah knew nothing about any of this. He was 9 years old. He lived in a world of dinosaurs and video games and the simple happiness of childhood. He noticed that his sister had been quiet lately. He noticed that his parents argued more than usual, but he assumed it would pass. He assumed everything would be okay. On the last morning of his life, he left a note on Ivy's door. It said, "I love you, sis." It said, "Can we play this weekend?" It said, "I saved you the blue popsicle again." She never read it. Or maybe she did, and it changed nothing. Maybe she had already made her decision. Maybe she had already accepted what she was about to do. The note would be found later by investigators. It would be photographed and cataloged and entered into evidence. It would be shown to jurors who would struggle to understand how anyone could harm a child who loved them this much. But there was no understanding. There was only the truth. A brother who trusted, a sister who betrayed, a piece of paper that meant everything and nothing at the same time. The last photograph of the Vale family together was taken at a neighbor's barbecue 2 weeks before the murders. Adrienne is smiling, Elena is laughing, Noah is making a silly face, and Ivy is standing slightly apart. Her expression is pleasant but empty. Her eyes are looking at something outside the frame, something no one else could see. The photograph would later appear on news broadcasts around the country. It would become the symbol of what Belmere lost, a perfect family, frozen in a perfect moment, a lie that lasted just long enough to destroy everyone inside it. The night of the murders began like any other. Elena made dinner, chicken and vegetables and a salad that Noah refused to eat. Adrienne came home late from Chambers. He was tired. He was stressed. A difficult custody case had been weighing on him. He kissed his wife on the forehead and ruffled his son's hair and asked about everyone's day. They sat around the table. They said grace. They passed dishes and made small talk and pretended everything was normal. But nothing was normal. The decision about the boarding school hung over them like a storm cloud. Tomorrow, the paperwork would be signed. Tomorrow, the process would begin. Tomorrow, Ivy's life would change forever. She sat through dinner without speaking. She pushed food around her plate. She answered questions with one-word replies. Her parents exchanged glances. They assumed she was sulking. They assumed she would adjust. They did not realize she was memorizing their positions, their routines, their vulnerabilities. She watched her father put his phone on the kitchen counter. She watched her mother load the dishwasher with her back to the room. She watched her brother finish early and run upstairs to play. She watched and waited and felt nothing. Nothing but the cold clarity of someone who had already decided what the night would bring. At 10 o'clock, Adrienne checked the locks. He checked the windows. He checked the alarm system he had installed after a burglary scare 2 years earlier. He was a careful man, a prepared man, a man who believed in security and precaution. But he did not check his daughter's room. He did not check the browser history on her phone. He did not check the note she had written and deleted and written again. He trusted his home. He trusted his family. He trusted the illusion that danger always comes from outside. Elena took Noah to bed at 10:15. She read him a chapter from his favorite dinosaur book. She tucked him in. She kissed his forehead. She told him tomorrow would be a good day. She turned on his nightlight and pulled his door almost closed and stood in the hallway for a moment, feeling the strange sadness that sometimes came over her at night. The sadness of time passing. The sadness of children growing up. The sadness of knowing that nothing stays the same forever. She could not have known how prophetic that feeling was. She could not have known that nothing would ever be the same again. Adrienne went to bed at 11. He told Elena he loved her. He set his alarm for 6:30. He closed his eyes and fell asleep within minutes. Elena stayed awake longer. She scrolled through her phone. She checked the weather. She looked at old photographs of the children when they were young. She wondered if she had failed Ivy somehow. If there was something she could have done differently. Some word she could have said. Some moment she could have caught. The guilt was irrational but persistent. It would follow her to her grave, a grave that was only 90 minutes away. At 11:45, Ivy opened her bedroom door. The house was dark. The hallway was silent. She could hear her father snoring faintly from down the hall. She could hear the clock ticking in the living room. She could hear her own heartbeat steady and calm. No fear, no hesitation, only purpose. She moved to her father's office. She knew the code to the safe. She had watched him open it dozens of times. He had never thought to hide it from her. He had never thought she was watching. He had never thought his daughter was capable of what she was about to do. The safe opened with a soft click. The gun was exactly where she knew it would be. A 9mm Glock with a full magazine. She had never fired it before, but she had watched videos. She had read tutorials. She had practiced holding it in front of the mirror when no one was home. The weight felt right in her hands. The metal was cold against her palms. She stood there for a moment, breathing slowly, feeling the power, feeling the certainty, feeling the absolute conviction that this was the only way. She went downstairs first. She knew her mother sometimes came down for water. She knew the kitchen was the most likely place to find her. She waited in the shadows near the pantry. She listened to the house settling around her. She let the minutes pass. 12:15, 12:20, 12:23. And then she heard footsteps on the stairs, light footsteps, bare feet on hardwood, her mother coming down for a glass of water just like she always did. Elena did not see her at first. She walked to the refrigerator. She opened it. She reached for the water pitcher. The light from the refrigerator made her face look soft and tired. She was wearing the old t-shirt she always slept in. She was thinking about tomorrow, about the paperwork, about how to make the transition easier for Ivy, about whether she should buy new clothes for the boarding school or let Ivy choose her own. She was thinking about the future. She did not know she had no future left. The first shot caught Elena in the torso. She stumbled backward. She did not scream. She simply looked at her daughter with an expression of total incomprehension, as if she could not process what was happening, as if her brain refused to accept that this was real. She reached out her hand. Whether to stop the next bullet or to touch her daughter one last time, nobody would ever know. The second shot hit her chest. She fell against the kitchen island. She slid to the floor. She tried to crawl toward the doorway, toward the stairs, toward her son, but her body would not obey her anymore. The last thing she saw was her daughter standing over her, watching, not crying, not apologizing, just watching. Adrienne heard the shots. He woke with a start. He called out for Elena. He called out for the children. No one answered. He got out of bed. He moved toward the door. He was still half asleep, still confused, still believing that there must be some explanation. A television left on too loud, a car backfiring outside. Anything but the truth. He opened his bedroom door and stepped into the hallway. And there was his daughter, standing at the top of the stairs, holding his gun, pointing it directly at his chest. He said her name. He said it like a question, like a prayer, like someone trying to wake from a nightmare. Ivy, what are you doing? Ivy, put that down. Ivy, we can talk about this. But there was nothing to talk about. There was no negotiation. There was no bargaining. There was only the choice she had already made. She fired twice, once in the chest, once in the shoulder. Adrienne fell against the wall. He slid down, leaving a streak of red on the white paint. He tried to speak. He tried to understand. But understanding would not come. His daughter stood over him. His little girl. The child he had held in the hospital on the day she was born. The child he had loved more than his own life. And then she walked away. She left him dying in the hallway. She had one more task to complete. Noah's room was at the end of the hall. The door was slightly open. The nightlight cast a blue glow across the carpet. She could see his dinosaur posters on the wall. She could see his toy chest in the corner. She could smell the clean laundry scent of his bed sheets. He was sleeping. He had not heard the shots, or if he had assumed they were something else, a dream, a noise from outside. Nothing to worry about. Big Sister would protect him. Big Sister always kept him safe. She stood in the doorway for 11 seconds. The investigators would determine this later from the timeline of events. 11 seconds during which she could have stopped. 11 seconds during which she could have chosen differently. 11 seconds during which she looked at her little brother's sleeping face and felt nothing. No love, no guilt, no hesitation. Only the cold recognition that he was a witness. a complication, someone who might tell the truth if she let him live. She raised the gun, she pulled the trigger, and then there was silence. The staging began immediately. She had thought about this part carefully. She knew the police would look for evidence. She knew they would ask questions. She knew her story needed to be perfect. She went downstairs and broke the basement window from the inside. She unlocked the back door and relocked it. She moved her mother's phone to a different room. She turned on the television to create confusion about the timeline. She changed her clothes. She washed her hands. She practiced crying in the bathroom mirror. She told herself the story she would tell the police, again and again until it felt real, until she almost believed it herself. At 12:51, she called 911. She was hiding in her closet. She was whispering. She was scared. A man had broken in. A man had hurt her family. A man had left her alive for reasons she could not explain. She begged the dispatcher to send help. She sobbed into the phone. She gave them the address. She gave them the perfect performance. And then she waited. She waited for the sirens. She waited for the questions. And she waited for the future she had just created with 3 bullets and 11 minutes of staging. When the police arrived, she was sitting on the stairs, small, fragile, innocent, a child who had survived something terrible, a victim who needed comfort. They wrapped her in a blanket. They told her she was safe. They told her they would find the man who did this. They believed her. Of course they believed her. She was 15 years old. She was the judge's daughter. She had just lost her entire family. Who would suspect a child of something so monstrous? Who would even consider the possibility that the only survivor was also the only killer? But evidence does not care about assumptions. Evidence does not care about age or family name or performance. Evidence only tells the truth. And the truth was already waiting. In the camera footage. In the digital records. In the gunshot residue on her sleeves. In the timeline that did not match her story. In the search history she thought she had deleted. The truth was patient. The truth was thorough. The truth would find her no matter how well she had planned. Because Ivy Vale had made one crucial mistake. She had believed she was smarter than everyone else. She had believed her father's legacy would protect her. She had believed she could get away with murder. And she was catastrophically wrong. The investigation began before the sun came up. Yellow tape circled the Vale property like a warning. Officers stood at the perimeter keeping neighbors and reporters at a distance. Inside the house, forensic technicians moved with careful precision. They photographed everything. They measured everything. They collected everything that might become evidence. Blood samples, fingerprints, shell casings, fiber traces. The house that had once held a family now held only questions. And the answers were hiding in places no one had thought to look yet. Detective Carla Mendez took charge of the case. She had been awake for 22 hours, but showed no signs of fatigue. This was the kind of case that demanded everything. A judge murdered in his own home. His wife and son killed beside him. The only survivor, a teenage girl with a story that felt too clean. Carla had worked homicides for 15 years. She had learned to trust her instincts, and her instincts were telling her something was deeply wrong. The first priority was establishing a timeline. When did the killings happen? In what order? How much time passed between each shot? Or the medical examiner provided preliminary estimates. Elena was killed first, somewhere between midnight and 12:30. Adrienne was killed second, perhaps 5 to 10 minutes later. Noah was killed last, sometime after 12:30. The sequence mattered because it contradicted Ivy's story. She claimed she heard shots and immediately hid. She claimed she called 911 as soon as she could. But the call came at 12:51. If the killings ended by 12:35, that left at least 16 minutes unaccounted for. 16 minutes during which a terrified child supposedly did nothing but hide. Carla wrote the number on her notepad. 16 minutes. She circled it twice. She added a question mark. Then she returned to the crime scene and started looking for answers. The broken window in the basement was the first red flag. Glass fragments had fallen outside the house, not inside. That meant the window had been broken from within. An intruder breaking in would have pushed glass inward. Someone staging a break-in would have pushed glass outward. It was a small detail, but it changed everything. The window was not evidence of an intrusion. It was evidence of deception. The back door told a similar story. Ivy claimed the intruder had entered through that door and fled the same way. But there were no signs of forced entry, no scratches on the lock, no damage to the frame, no muddy footprints on the floor. Either the intruder had been impossibly careful, or the intruder had never existed. Carla examined the door handle for fingerprints. She found several sets. Most belonged to family members. One set was too smudged to identify. But none belonged to an unknown stranger. None suggested anyone from outside had touched that door on the night of the murders. The breakthrough came from across the street. Harold Weston was a retired accountant who lived alone in a modest ranch house. He had installed security cameras 3 years earlier after someone stole a package from his porch. The cameras covered his driveway and his front yard. But one camera was angled slightly wider than the others. It captured a sliver of the Vale property. Specifically, it captured their back door and a portion of their side yard. Harold had not thought much of this until police came knocking. He had not realized his camera might have recorded something important. The footage was grainy, low resolution, shot in night vision mode that made everything look green and ghostly. But it was enough. Carla and her team reviewed the recording from 11 p.m. to 2 a.m. They watched in real time. Then they watched in slow motion. Then they watched frame by frame. What they saw destroyed Ivy's story completely. At 12:14 a.m., the back door of the Vale house opened. A figure stepped out briefly. The figure was small. The figure was wearing what appeared to be dark clothing. The figure looked around for a moment, then stepped back inside and closed the door. The door did not open again until police arrived hours later. No intruder entered the house. No intruder fled into the night. The only person who went through that door was already inside the house. The only person who used that door was checking to make sure no one was watching. Carla paused the footage on the clearest frame. The figure was blurry, but the proportions were clear. This was not a tall man in dark clothes. This was a teenage girl. This was Ivy Vale, stepping outside at 12:14, 5 minutes before the estimated time of her mother's death, checking the yard, checking for witnesses, then going back inside to do what she had planned. The timeline now made terrible sense. Ivy checked outside at 12:14. She killed Elena around 12:20. She killed Adrienne around 12:30. She killed Noah around 12:35. Then she spent the next 15 minutes staging the scene, breaking the window, moving objects, changing clothes, practicing her story. Only then did she call 911. Only then did she become the victim she needed the world to believe she was. But the camera footage was just the beginning. The digital forensics provided even more damning evidence. Ivy's phone had been seized as part of the investigation. She had tried to delete certain files before handing it over. She had cleared her browser history. She had removed apps. She had done everything a guilty person would do to hide their tracks. But digital deletion is rarely permanent. Forensic technicians know how to recover what users think they have erased. And what they found on Ivy's phone painted a portrait of premeditation. The search history stretched back weeks. How to clean gunshot residue from clothing. How long does blood take to dry? What do home invasion crime scenes look like? How are juvenile murderers sentenced in Mississippi? Can minors get the death penalty? Each search was time-stamped. Each search showed a mind preparing for violence. This was not a spontaneous act of rage. This was a calculated plan developed over days and weeks. A plan researched on the same phone she used to text friends and scroll social media. A plan hidden in plain sight. The messages were even more revealing. Ivy had been texting a friend named Brianna on the night of the murders. The conversation started at 11 p.m. Brianna asked what Ivy was doing. Ivy said she was bored. Brianna asked about the boarding school situation. Ivy said her parents were ruining her life. Then, at 11:42, Ivy sent a message that would later be projected on a courtroom screen for all to see. She wrote by tomorrow they will not control anything anymore. Brianna responded with a confused emoji. Ivy did not reply. She was already preparing for what came next. There was also the matter of the gun safe. Adrienne's Glock was stored in a safe that required a 4-digit code. The code was 2814, Adrienne and Elena's wedding anniversary. August 14th. Ivy knew that code. She had watched her father open the safe dozens of times. She had never shown interest in guns. She had never asked to learn how to shoot, but she had been paying attention. She had been memorizing. She had been waiting for the moment when that knowledge would become useful. And on the night of the murders, she had opened that safe without hesitation, without fumbling, without triggering the alarm that would have sounded after 3 failed attempts. The forensic evidence continued to accumulate. Gunshot residue was found on Ivy's sleeves. She claimed this was from hugging her parents after finding them. But the residue pattern was inconsistent with that explanation. The particles were concentrated on her hands and forearms. The pattern suggested she had been holding and firing a weapon, not embracing someone who had already been shot. Her clothing told another story. She claimed she had been hiding in her closet throughout the attack, but her socks were clean. Her sweatshirt had no dust from the closet floor. Her hair had no cobwebs. She looked like someone who had been walking through the house, not cowering in a corner. Small details, but small details add up. Small details become the evidence that convictions are built on. Detective Carla Mendez assembled the evidence in her office. She spread photographs across her desk. She created a timeline on her whiteboard. She listed every inconsistency, every contradiction, every lie. The picture that emerged was clear and horrifying. A 15-year-old girl had planned and executed the murder of her entire family. She had staged the scene to look like a home invasion. She had called the police and performed the role of traumatized survivor. She had believed her father's reputation would protect her. She had believed no one would suspect the judge's daughter. And she had almost been right. But almost is not enough in a murder investigation. Almost does not erase camera footage. Almost does not delete search histories from servers. Almost does not wash gunshot residue from skin. Almost does not explain away 16 minutes of silence between the last shot and the first call. Ivy Vale had planned carefully. She had executed precisely. But she had underestimated the persistence of evidence. She had underestimated the dedication of investigators who would not stop until they found the truth. The decision to arrest Ivy was not made lightly. She was a minor. She had just lost her family. The public still believed she was a victim. Moving too quickly could create sympathy and undermine the case. Moving too slowly could allow her to flee or destroy evidence or prepare a more sophisticated defense. Carla consulted with the district attorney. They reviewed the evidence together. They agreed that the case was strong enough to proceed. They agreed that waiting any longer posed unacceptable risks. The arrest warrant was signed at 4 p.m. on the 3rd day after the murders. Deputy Marcus Trent was given the task of serving it. He drove to the home of Ivy's aunt, where she had been staying since the night of the killings. He knocked on the door. He explained that Ivy needed to come with him. The aunt protested. She demanded explanations. She said there must be some mistake, but there was no mistake. There was only the truth that Belmere was finally being forced to face. Ivy emerged from the back bedroom. She was wearing new clothes her aunt had bought her. Her hair was brushed. Her face was calm. She looked at Deputy Trent and asked one question. Is this about the boarding school thing? Not about her family, not about the investigation. About the boarding school her parents had been planning to send her to. The school that now had no one to send her and no one to pay the tuition. the school that had become irrelevant the moment she pulled the trigger. Deputy Trent did not answer her question. He simply read her the Miranda rights. He placed handcuffs on her wrists. He led her to the patrol car. Her aunt was crying. Neighbors were watching. Someone was already filming with a phone. By nightfall, the video would be on every news station in the state. The judge's daughter being arrested for murder. The sole survivor revealed as the sole suspect. The story that everyone wanted to believe being replaced by the story that no one wanted to accept. At the police station, Ivy was processed and photographed. Her mugshot showed no tears, no remorse, no fear. She looked directly at the camera with the same flat expression she had worn throughout the investigation, as if this was happening to someone else, as if she was watching from outside her own body, as if none of it was real. The photograph would appear on front pages and news broadcasts for months to come. It would become the image people remembered when they heard her name, the face of a daughter who had destroyed the family that raised her. The interrogation that followed lasted 3 hours. Ivy's court-appointed attorney was present. She advised Ivy not to answer questions, but Ivy wanted to talk. She wanted to explain. She wanted to convince everyone that they were making a terrible mistake. So she told her story again. The intruder, the dark clothes, the hiding, the fear. She told it with the same polish she had used on the first night, but now the detectives had evidence. Now they had the camera footage. Now they had the search history. And one by one, they dismantled every lie she told. When they showed her the footage from Harold Weston's camera, her expression finally changed. Just for a moment. A flicker of something crossing her face. Surprise, recognition, fear. Then it was gone. Replaced by the mask she had worn so long, it had become her only face. She said the footage was unclear. She said it could be anyone. She said they were trying to frame her because they needed someone to blame. But even her attorney knew the argument would not hold. Even her attorney could see that the case was already lost. The charges were filed the following morning. 3 counts of first-degree murder, 1 count of filing a false police report, 1 count of tampering with evidence. The prosecutor announced that the state would seek to try Ivy as an adult. Given the nature of the crimes and the evidence of premeditation, the court would likely agree. Ivy Vale would face the same justice system her father had served. She would stand in a courtroom much like the ones where he had presided. And she would answer for what she had done. Outside the courthouse, reporters gathered with cameras and microphones. They wanted statements. They wanted explanations. They wanted to understand how a 15-year-old girl could do something so unthinkable. But there were no easy explanations. There was only the evidence, the camera footage, the search history, the messages, the timeline, the gunshot residue, the lies that had collapsed under the weight of truth. Belmere had lost its favorite family, and now it had to accept that the killer had been inside the house all along. The phone told stories Ivy never intended to share. When forensic technicians extracted data from her device, they found a parallel life hidden beneath the surface. See, a life of secrets and lies and careful manipulation. A life that had been building toward violence long before the night her family died. The digital evidence would become the backbone of the prosecution's case. It would show that Ivy Vale was not a child who snapped under pressure. She was a predator who planned her attack with patience and precision. The recovery process took 3 days. Technicians used specialized software to access deleted files and cached data and server logs that Ivy thought she had erased. They rebuilt her browsing history month by month. They recovered text messages she had deleted. They found photographs she had tried to hide. Every digital footprint she had left became another piece of evidence. Another brick in the wall the prosecution was building around her. The earliest warning signs appeared 6 months before the murders. Ivy had started searching for information about family annihilation cases. She read articles about children who had killed their parents. She watched documentaries about juvenile murderers. She visited forums where people discussed famous crimes with detached fascination. At first, the searches seemed random, morbid curiosity that many teenagers might share. But as the months passed, the searches became more specific, more practical, more focused on how crimes were committed and how criminals were caught. 3 months before the murders, she started researching guns, not hunting rifles or sport shooting, specifically handguns, specifically the model her father kept in his office safe. She watched videos about how the Glock 9mm operated. She read about ammunition types and effective range and stopping power. She searched for information about recoil and accuracy and how to hold the weapon properly. She was teaching herself how to use a gun she would later claim she had never touched. 2 months before the murders, she started researching crime scene investigation. She wanted to know what evidence police looked for. She wanted to know how detectives identified suspects. She wanted to know what mistakes criminals made that led to their capture. She searched for information about blood spatter analysis and fingerprint recovery and digital forensics. She was studying her future investigators the way a chess player studies an opponent, looking for weaknesses, looking for blind spots, looking for ways to stay one step ahead. 1 month before the murders, she started researching staging, specifically how criminals staged crime scenes to mislead investigators. She read about cases where killers had made murders look like accidents or suicides or break-ins. She studied what worked and what failed. She took notes in a document she later deleted, notes about window breaks and door locks and the importance of consistency in storytelling, notes that showed she was not just fantasizing about violence. She was engineering it. The week before the murders, her searches became urgent. How to remove gunshot residue from clothing. How long before neighbors report hearing shots? What do police look for in home invasion cases? Do security cameras work at night? Can deleted texts be recovered? Each question revealed another layer of her planning. But each answer she found became part of the blueprint she would follow. She was not spiraling out of control. She was preparing with the focus of someone completing a project. The text messages provided context for the searches. Ivy had been communicating with several people in the weeks before the murders. Most of the conversations were ordinary teenage exchanges, complaints about school, gossip about classmates, plans for weekends that would never happen. But buried within the ordinary were moments that now seemed like warnings. To her friend Brianna, she wrote that her parents were destroying her life, that she hated them, that she wished they would just disappear. Brianna assumed it was typical teenage venting. She responded with sympathetic emojis and suggestions to just wait until college. She had no idea Ivy was speaking literally. She had no idea Ivy was counting down the days until her parents would disappear forever. To another friend named Marcus, she wrote about feeling trapped. She said her family did not understand her. She said they wanted to send her away. She said she would do anything to stop them. Marcus asked what she meant by anything. Ivy did not respond. Some truths were too dangerous to put in writing. Some plans required silence. The most disturbing messages were to someone she called Jay. The identity of Jay was never fully established at trial. The number was linked to a prepaid phone purchased with cash. The account was created with a fake name. But the messages painted a picture of someone older, someone who encouraged Ivy's darkest impulses. Someone who told her she was special and misunderstood and destined for bigger things than her small-town family could offer. Jay told Ivy that her parents were holding her back, that they were jealous of her potential, that they wanted to control her because they were afraid of what she could become. The language was manipulative, grooming, designed to isolate Ivy from the people who loved her and replace their influence with something toxic. Whether Jay knew what Ivy was planning remained unclear. Whether Jay encouraged the violence remained unproven. But the messages showed that Ivy had found someone who validated her rage instead of challenging it. On the night of the murders, Ivy sent her final message to Jay. It was time-stamped at 11:37, just minutes before she retrieved the gun from her father's safe. The message was 3 words: "It is time." Jay never responded. Perhaps Jay was asleep. Perhaps Jay did not understand. Perhaps Jay understood perfectly and simply did not care. The prosecution would later argue that the message showed consciousness of intent, that Ivy had announced her plan to someone before carrying it out, that the murders were not impulsive, but scheduled. The digital evidence extended beyond texts and searches. Ivy had also taken photographs in the days before the murders, photographs that seemed innocent at first glance. The basement window from inside the house, the back door and its lock mechanism, the path from her father's office to the stairs. She was documenting the layout of her own home like a burglar casing a target. She was creating reference images she could study, planning her movements, planning her escape, planning the story she would tell when it was over. One photograph was particularly damning. It showed the gun safe in her father's office. The door was slightly open. The Glock was visible inside. The timestamp showed the image was taken 3 days before the murders. 3 days before Ivy would open that safe and take the weapon that killed her family. The photograph proved she had access. It proved she had interest. It proved she had been thinking about that gun long before she claimed to have ever touched it. The defense would later argue that the digital evidence was circumstantial, that searches did not prove intent, that photographs did not prove guilt, that messages could be misinterpreted. But the prosecution had a response for each objection. Searches alone might mean nothing. But searches combined with photographs, combined with messages, combined with the actual murders, painted an undeniable picture. Context transforms coincidence into evidence. Pattern transforms suspicion into proof. Detective Carla Mendez spent hours reviewing the digital evidence. She printed the most significant items and pinned them to her office wall. The timeline of searches, the key messages, the photographs. She drew lines between them, showing the progression of planning, from curiosity to research to preparation to execution. The wall became a map of Ivy's journey from troubled teenager to calculated killer, a journey that took months but led inevitably to a single night. The evidence also revealed something about Ivy's emotional state, or rather, her lack of emotional state. Throughout the weeks of planning, she continued to live normally. She went to school. She hung out with friends. She argued with her parents about curfew and homework and chores. She showed no signs of the internal turmoil that might accompany such a decision. She was not tormented by what she was planning. She was not wrestling with moral questions. She was simply working toward a goal with the same detachment she might apply to a school project. This emotional flatness would become a key element of the prosecution's case. They would argue that Ivy lacked the capacity for empathy that might have stopped her, that she viewed her family not as people, but as obstacles, that she could plan their deaths while eating dinner with them because she had long ago stopped seeing them as fully human. The defense would counter that this was evidence of mental illness, not criminal intent, that Ivy was suffering from some form of dissociation or detachment that prevented her from understanding what she was doing. The jury would have to decide which interpretation to believe. The digital evidence also provided something else, proof that Ivy knew her actions were wrong. If she truly believed she was justified, she would not have searched for ways to avoid detection. If she truly believed the world would understand, she would not have staged the crime scene to blame a phantom intruder. Her efforts to conceal proved that she understood the nature of her actions. She knew she was doing something terrible. She knew she would be punished if caught, and she did it anyway. That knowledge was the difference between insanity and evil. That knowledge was what made her culpable for what she had done. By the time the digital analysis was complete, the prosecution had more evidence than they needed. The camera footage placed Ivy at the crime scene during the murders. The search history showed months of planning. The text messages showed motive and intent. The photographs showed access and opportunity. The gunshot residue showed she had fired the weapon. The timeline showed her story was a lie. Each piece of evidence reinforced the others. Each piece made the defense's job more difficult. Ivy Vale had created a digital trail of breadcrumbs that led directly back to her own door. The defense team knew they were facing an uphill battle. The evidence was overwhelming. The public had already turned against their client. The only strategy that might work was to focus not on innocence, but on mitigation, to argue that Ivy was mentally ill, that she had been groomed by an unknown manipulator, that her brain was not fully developed and she could not be held to adult standards of culpability. It was not a strategy designed to achieve acquittal. It was a strategy designed to avoid the harshest possible sentence. But even that strategy faced problems. The digital evidence showed planning and rationality. The staging showed awareness of consequences. The performance after the murders showed an ability to adapt and deceive. These were not the actions of someone disconnected from reality. These were the actions of someone who understood reality very well and simply did not care about anyone but herself. The prosecution would hammer this point throughout the trial, and the jury would have to decide whether a 15-year-old girl who planned the murder of her family deserved mercy or justice. In the weeks following her arrest, Ivy Vale remained in juvenile detention awaiting trial. The facility was designed for young offenders, kids who had stolen cars or sold drugs or gotten into fights. It was not designed for someone accused of murdering their entire family. Ivy stood out. She was quieter than the other detainees, more watchful, more controlled. She followed the rules without complaint. She attended the required therapy sessions without resistance. She did everything she was supposed to do. And still something about her made the staff uncomfortable. The therapist assigned to her case was named Dr. Patricia Vance. She had worked with troubled adolescents for 20 years. She had seen violence and trauma and every form of dysfunction imaginable. But Ivy was different. Ivy did not present like a typical juvenile offender. She presented like someone playing a role, someone who had studied what a remorseful young person should look like and was performing that character with practiced skill. In their first session, Dr. Vance asked Ivy how she was feeling. Ivy said she was sad. She said she missed her family. She said she could not believe what had happened. The words were appropriate. The tone was appropriate. But the eyes were empty. Dr. Vance had learned to watch the eyes. The eyes told truths that words could hide. And Ivy's eyes showed no grief, no guilt, no fear, only a kind of calculating alertness. The look of someone always thinking 3 moves ahead. Doctor. Vance tried different approaches over the following sessions. She asked about Ivy's childhood. She asked about her relationships with her parents. She asked about school and friends and hopes for the future. Ivy answered each question with polished composure. She described a happy childhood. She described loving parents. She described normal teenage struggles that any family might face. She never once mentioned the evidence that had been gathered against her. She never once acknowledged the possibility that she might have done what she was accused of doing. When Dr. Vance gently raised the subject of the murders, Ivy's demeanor shifted slightly, not dramatically. Just a subtle tightening around the eyes, a small adjustment in posture. She said she did not want to talk about that night. She said it was too painful. She said the memories were too traumatic. But she did not cry. She did not tremble. She did not show any of the physical signs of genuine trauma. She simply declined and changed the subject with the smoothness of someone who had rehearsed the conversation in advance. The therapy notes would later become part of the court record. Dr. Vance documented her observations carefully. Patient presence with flat effect, inconsistent with stated emotions. Patient demonstrates sophisticated verbal skills and social awareness. Patient shows no signs of psychotic thinking or dissociation from reality. Patient appears to understand consequences of actions and legal proceedings. Patient deflects questions about the alleged crimes with practiced responses. The clinical language obscured a simpler truth. Ivy Vale was not crazy. She was cold. And no amount of therapy was going to change that. Meanwhile, the legal proceedings continued. The prosecution filed motion after motion. They sought to have Ivy tried as an adult, given the severity of the crimes. They sought to admit all digital evidence, including the deleted searches and messages. They sought to allow the camera footage from Harold Weston's property. The defense filed counter motions. They sought to suppress evidence they claimed was improperly obtained. They sought to have Ivy evaluated by their own psychiatric experts. They sought to delay the trial as long as possible, hoping public attention would fade. The decision to try Ivy as an adult came 3 weeks after her arrest. Judge Raymond Torres presided over the hearing. He was a colleague of Adrienne Vale. They had served together on the county bench for 15 years. He recused himself from the case initially, but was ultimately allowed to make the transfer decision since the trial itself would be handled by a different judge. He listened to arguments from both sides. He reviewed the evidence, and he ruled that the case would proceed in adult court. His reasoning was straightforward. The crimes were premeditated. The victims included a child. The evidence suggested planning and awareness of consequences. While Ivy's age was a factor to be considered, the nature of the offenses warranted adult prosecution. He noted that sentencing could still take her youth into account. But the trial itself would be conducted with the full weight of the adult justice system. It was the first major defeat for the defense. It would not be the last. The psychiatric evaluations became a battleground. The prosecution hired Dr. Samuel Roth, a forensic psychiatrist with decades of experience. He evaluated Ivy over several sessions. He administered psychological tests. He reviewed her academic records and social history and the digital evidence recovered from her phone. His conclusion was clear. Ivy Vale showed no signs of psychosis or cognitive impairment. She demonstrated above-average intelligence and sophisticated social manipulation skills. She met criteria for conduct disorder with callous and unemotional traits. She understood the wrongfulness of her actions and chose to commit them anyway. The defense hired their own expert. Dr. Michelle Tanner specialized in adolescent brain development and juvenile justice issues. She evaluated Ivy and reached different conclusions. She argued that Ivy's behavior was consistent with severe emotional dysregulation, that her actions reflected a brain still developing, unable to fully process consequences, that the presence of a possible manipulative relationship with the mysterious J suggested grooming and exploitation, that Ivy was a victim as much as a perpetrator, a child who needed treatment, not punishment. The competing evaluations set up the central conflict of the trial. Was Ivy Vale a cold-blooded killer who knew exactly what she was doing? Or was she a damaged child whose undeveloped brain made her incapable of true culpability? The answer would determine whether she spent decades in prison or received some form of rehabilitative sentence. It would determine whether the justice system saw her as an adult to be punished or a child to be saved. As the trial date approached, Ivy's behavior in detention began to change. She became more withdrawn, more watchful. She stopped participating actively in therapy sessions. She stopped making eye contact with staff. She spent hours alone in her cell, staring at the wall or writing in a notebook she refused to share. Some interpreted this as depression setting in. Others interpreted it as calculation. She was preparing for something, planning her next performance, deciding who she would be when the cameras started rolling. Her aunt visited weekly, the same aunt who had taken her in after the murders, who had believed her story until the evidence made belief impossible. The visits were awkward. What do you say to a niece accused of killing your sister? How do you look at a child who may have murdered your nephew in his bed? The aunt tried to maintain some connection. She brought books and magazines. She talked about family history and shared memories. She never mentioned the case directly. Neither did Ivy. They sat across from each other, speaking about nothing, while everything that mattered hung unspoken between them. The media attention intensified as the trial approached. News trucks parked outside the courthouse. Reporters filed stories speculating about evidence and strategy. Legal analysts debated the merits of the prosecution's case. Social media exploded with opinions from people who had never met the Vale family but felt entitled to judge them anyway. Some argued that Ivy was a monster who deserved the maximum sentence. Others argued she was a child who had been failed by her parents and society. Both sides spoke with absolute certainty. Neither side had access to the full truth. The courtroom was assigned. Judge Helen Blackwood would preside. She was known for her careful deliberation and no-nonsense demeanor. She had handled murder cases before, but nothing quite like this. A teenage defendant accused of killing her entire family. A respected judge among the victims, a community watching every move. The pressure would be immense. The scrutiny would be unrelenting. She would need to manage the case with precision to ensure a fair trial despite the surrounding chaos. Jury selection took 2 weeks. Finding 12 people in Belmere who had not already formed opinions about the case seemed almost impossible. Everyone knew the Vale family. Everyone had heard the stories. Everyone had seen the camera footage on the evening news. The defense moved for a change of venue, arguing that a fair trial could not be obtained in the county. The motion was denied, but the judge agreed to expand the jury pool to include surrounding areas. Eventually, 12 jurors and 4 alternates were selected. Ordinary people tasked with deciding an extraordinary case. The trial was scheduled to begin in March. By then, Ivy would have spent nearly 8 months in detention, 8 months of evaluations and hearings and waiting, 8 months of maintaining her mask while the world tried to see through it, 8 months of pretending to be something she was not, a scared child, a victim of circumstance, someone who deserved compassion. The trial would test that performance like nothing before. The evidence would be presented. The witnesses would testify. The truth would finally have its day. And Ivy Vale would have to face the consequences of what she had done on that night when she walked through her own home with her father's gun and ended 3 lives that had trusted her. The trial opened on a cold Tuesday morning in March. The courtroom was packed, every seat filled with reporters and spectators and family members seeking answers. The gallery buzzed with whispered conversations until Judge Blackwood entered, and silence fell like a curtain. She surveyed the room with steady eyes. She reminded everyone of the gravity of the proceedings. She warned against outbursts and disruptions. Then she turned to the prosecution and invited them to begin. District Attorney Marcus Webb rose from his seat. He was a tall man with gray hair and a voice that carried without effort. He had prosecuted cases in this county for 30 years. And he had known Adrienne Vale personally, had attended barbecues at the Vale home, had once judged a mock trial competition where Ivy won first place. Now he stood before a jury preparing to argue that the daughter of his friend and colleague had murdered her entire family in cold blood. It was the hardest opening statement of his career. He started with the victims. Elena Vale, 45 years old, devoted mother, beloved wife, a woman who volunteered at the school library and remembered everyone's birthday. She was killed first, shot in her own kitchen while getting a glass of water. She lived long enough to try to crawl toward the stairs, toward her children, toward help that would never come. She died on the kitchen floor of the home where she had raised her family. Adrienne Vale, 48 years old, respected judge, loving father, a man who had dedicated his life to justice and fairness. He was killed second, shot in the hallway of his own home while trying to understand what was happening. He died looking at his daughter. The last thing he saw was the face of the child he had loved more than his own life, the child who was pointing his own gun at his chest. Noah Vale, 9 years old, innocent, trusting, a boy who loved dinosaurs and believed his sister would protect him from monsters. He was killed last, shot in his bed while sleeping under a dinosaur blanket. He never woke up. He never knew what happened. He died believing the world was safe, believing his family loved him, believing tomorrow would come. Marcus Webb let the silence hang after describing the victims. He wanted the jury to feel their absence, to understand what had been lost. Then he turned to the defendant, Ivy Vale, 15 years old, the only survivor of the massacre, the person who called 911 and reported a home invasion, the person who cried and trembled and played the victim perfectly, and the person whose own digital footprint proved beyond any doubt that she had planned and executed the murders herself. The evidence would be overwhelming. The camera footage showing no intruder entering or leaving. The search history showing months of research. The text messages showing motive and intent. The gunshot residue on her clothing. The timeline that exposed her story as a lie. The staged break-in. The false report. The cold composure in the hours after she had ended 3 lives. Piece by piece, the prosecution would build a case so strong that no reasonable jury could doubt. And when all the evidence had been presented, they would ask for justice. Not vengeance, justice. For Elena, for Adrienne, for Noah, for a family that had been destroyed by one of its own. The defense attorney rose next. Her name was Catherine Price. She was younger than Webb and less experienced in murder trials. But she was sharp and passionate and committed to giving her client the best possible defense. She knew the evidence was damning. She knew the public had already convicted Ivy in their minds. Her only hope was to shift the narrative, to make the jury see not a cold-blooded killer, but a broken child who needed help. She acknowledged the tragedy immediately. 3 people were dead. A family had been destroyed. Nothing, she said, would change that. But understanding what happened was more complicated than the prosecution wanted to admit. Ivy Vale was not a monster. She was a 15-year-old girl. Her brain was not fully developed. Her judgment was impaired by adolescence and emotional turmoil and influences she was too young to resist. The prosecution would show evidence of planning. But planning by an adult and planning by a disturbed teenager were not the same thing. The prosecution would show callous behavior. But callousness could be a symptom of trauma and dissociation, not evidence of evil intent. The prosecution would ask the jury to see Ivy as an adult criminal. The defense asked them to see her as what she was. A child who had done something terrible, a child who needed help and treatment and a chance at redemption. Not a child who should be thrown away and forgotten. The opening statements set the battle lines. 2 narratives competing for the jury's belief. One painted Ivy as a calculating predator who deserved the harshest punishment. The other painted her as a victim of her own undeveloped brain who deserved compassion. Both sides would spend the next weeks trying to prove their version of the truth. Both sides knew that everything depended on what the jury chose to believe. The first witnesses were the first responders. Deputy Marcus Trent described arriving at the Vale home, the smell of blood, the bodies in the hallway and kitchen, the small figure sitting on the stairs wrapped in a blanket. He described Ivy's demeanor, calm, controlled, asking about her phone instead of her parents. The jury listened intently. Some took notes. On others simply stared at the defendant, trying to reconcile the image of a child with the crimes she was accused of committing. The crime scene technicians followed. They described the evidence collection process in clinical detail. Blood samples and shell casings and fingerprints. They showed photographs of the scene. The kitchen where Elena fell. The hallway where Adrienne died. The bedroom where Noah would never wake. Each photograph hit the jury like a physical blow. Some covered their mouths. Some wiped their eyes. The reality of what had happened was becoming impossible to ignore. Then came the medical examiner. Dr. Linda Foster had performed the autopsies on all 3 victims. She testified about cause of death, gunshot wounds to vital organs. She testified about time of death, sometime between midnight and 1 a.m. She testified about the sequence of deaths based on blood pooling and wound characteristics. Elena first, then Adrienne, then Noah. Her testimony was technical but devastating. It transformed the victims from names into bodies, bodies that had suffered, bodies that had died. The prosecution's case built methodically over the following days. Harold Weston testified about his security camera. He described the footage it had captured. The defense objected. They argued the footage was unclear and potentially misleading. The judge overruled. The footage was played for the jury. Grainy green images showing the back door opening, a small figure stepping out, checking the yard, stepping back inside. No intruder, no stranger, only the defendant at the moment the murders were being committed. The digital forensics expert testified next. Doctor, Ryan Chen had recovered the deleted data from Ivy's phone. He explained the technical process in terms the jury could understand. Then he presented the findings. The search history, the photographs, the text messages. He read the key passages aloud. By tomorrow, they will not control anything anymore. The words hung in the air like a confession. The jury wrote furiously. The defense objected repeatedly. Objections overruled. The evidence was admitted. The truth was becoming undeniable. Day after day, the prosecution piled evidence upon evidence. Gunshot residue analysis, timeline reconstructions, expert testimony about staged crime scenes. Witnesses who had seen Ivy researching guns at the school library, friends who had heard her talk about hating her parents, teachers who had noticed her detachment and manipulation. Each witness added another piece to the puzzle. Each piece made the final picture clearer. Through it all, Ivy sat at the defense table. She wore modest clothes. Her hair was pulled back neatly. She showed little expression. Occasionally, she whispered to her attorney. Occasionally, she sipped water from a plastic cup. She did not cry during the autopsy testimony. She did not flinch during the photographs. She watched the proceedings with the same flat attention she had shown since the night of her arrest, as if she were observing something that had nothing to do with her, as if the trial were happening to someone else. The jury watched her as closely as she watched them. They were trying to read her, trying to understand what kind of person could do what she was accused of doing. They saw no remorse, no grief, no fear. They saw only stillness, only calm, only the mask she had worn so long it had become impossible to remove. And in that stillness they began to see their answer. Not a traumatized child, not a victim of circumstance, something else entirely, something that scared them more than any evidence possibly could. The prosecution's case continued into its second week. Each day brought new witnesses. Each witness brought new evidence. The weight was crushing. The defense objected when they could. They challenged credibility when possible. But the mountain of proof kept growing, and Ivy Vale sat at the center of it all, watching, waiting, showing nothing. The ballistics expert took the stand on Monday morning. His name was Dr. Frank Morrison. He had spent 30 years analyzing firearms evidence for law enforcement agencies across the country. He had testified in over 200 trials. He spoke with the calm authority of someone who knew his work could not be questioned. The prosecution handed him the murder weapon. He examined it briefly. Then he explained what the bullets told him. All 3 victims had been killed by rounds fired from the same gun. A 9mm Glock registered to Adrienne Vale. The bullets recovered from the bodies matched the rifling pattern of that specific weapon. The shell casings found at the scene matched the firing pin impression of that specific weapon. There was no doubt, no ambiguity, no possibility that another gun had been involved. The weapon that killed Elena and Adrienne and Noah Vale had come from Adrienne's own safe. The weapon had been in the home all along. The defense cross-examined carefully. They asked whether someone else could have taken the gun from the safe. Dr. Morrison agreed that was theoretically possible. They asked whether the ballistics evidence proved who fired the weapon. Dr. Morrison admitted it did not. Ballistics could match a bullet to a gun. It could not put a finger on the trigger. The defense had scored a small point, but it was lost in the larger context. The gun came from the house. The defendant was the only survivor. The timeline made any other scenario impossible. Next came the gunshot residue analyst. Her name was Dr. Patricia Huang. She had examined the clothing Ivy was wearing on the night of the murders. She had tested her hands and arms for particle traces. The results were conclusive. Gunshot residue was present on both of Ivy's hands. Residue was present on the sleeves of her sweatshirt. Residue was present on the front of her shirt. The pattern was consistent with someone who had fired a handgun multiple times. It was not consistent with someone who had simply touched or embraced a shooting victim. The defense challenged this testimony aggressively. They argued that gunshot residue could transfer in many ways: hugging a victim, touching contaminated surfaces, being near a discharged weapon. Dr. Huang acknowledged these possibilities, but she explained that the pattern on Ivy's clothing was distinctive: the concentration on the hands, the distribution on the sleeves. These suggested active participation, not passive exposure. Someone who fired a weapon would have this pattern. Someone who merely embraced a victim would not. Catherine Price pushed harder. She asked about the reliability of gunshot residue analysis. She cited studies questioning the accuracy of such evidence. She suggested that contamination could have occurred at the crime scene. Dr. Huang remained calm. She explained that samples had been collected using proper protocols, that controls had been run to eliminate contamination, that the evidence met all scientific standards for admissibility. The jury listened. They took notes. They looked at Ivy's hands resting on the defense table, the same hands that had been covered in residue, the same hands that had held the gun. The timeline testimony came next. Detective Carla Mendez returned to the stand. She had assembled all the evidence into a comprehensive reconstruction of the night. She presented it to the jury minute by minute. Her presentation was precise. Her delivery was methodical. She wanted the jury to understand exactly how the events had unfolded. At 11:45, Ivy was seen on her own phone checking social media. She was in her bedroom. Her parents were asleep. Her brother was asleep. The house was quiet. At 11:50, her phone showed no activity. She had put it down. She was preparing. At 12:05, she accessed the hallway. Motion sensors on the home security system registered movement on the second floor. At 12:10, she was in her father's office. The safe was opened. The gun was taken. At 12:14, Harold Weston's camera captured her checking the back door, looking for witnesses, making sure no one was watching. At 12:18, the first shot was fired. Elena in the kitchen. The medical examiner's time of death estimate aligned with this moment. At 12:25, the second shots were fired. Adrienne in the hallway. At 12:32, the final shot was fired. Noah in his bedroom. At 12:35, the staging began. Breaking 35, the staging began. Breaking the window. Moving objects. Practicing her story. At 12:51, she called 911. 16 minutes after the last shot. 16 minutes of staging and preparation. 16 minutes that proved the call was not the panicked response of a victim. It was the calculated performance of a killer. Detective Mendez presented phone records and motion data and camera timestamps. Everything aligned. Everything pointed to the same conclusion. Ivy Vale had committed these murders exactly as the prosecution claimed. The defense had few questions for Detective Mendez. The timeline was solid. The evidence was verified from multiple independent sources. Catherine Price simply asked whether any of this evidence proved who fired the gun. Detective Mendez acknowledged it did not prove that single fact in isolation. But she added that when combined with all other evidence, the conclusion was inescapable. The only person in that house who could have fired those shots was the defendant. The only person with access, motive, and opportunity was Ivy Vale. The text message evidence was presented next. Prosecutors displayed the messages on large screens so the jury could read them clearly. They started with the messages to Brianna, complaints about parents, anger about being sent away. The line about tomorrow they will not control anything anymore, Brianna testified briefly. She confirmed the messages were authentic. She confirmed she had not understood what Ivy meant at the time. She wept on the stand. She had considered Ivy a friend. She had not imagined her friend was capable of murder. The messages to Marcus were shown next. Marcus did not testify. He had refused to cooperate with either side, but the messages spoke for themselves. Ivy writing about feeling trapped, about doing anything to stop her parents, about wanting to be free. The words were vague enough to provide some defense, but in context, they were damning. This was someone building toward violence, someone looking for permission, someone waiting for the right moment to act. The messages to the mysterious J were the most damaging. The prosecution acknowledged they had not identified J. The phone number led to a dead end, but the messages revealed an influence in Ivy's life, someone who encouraged her worst impulses, someone who told her she was being oppressed by her own family, someone who validated her rage instead of challenging it. The final message was displayed in isolation. It is time. 3 words sent minutes before the murders began. 3 words that showed planning and intent and consciousness of guilt. The prosecution rested on Friday afternoon. They had presented evidence for 12 days. Dozens of witnesses, hundreds of exhibits. A case so comprehensive that even experienced observers called it overwhelming. Marcus Webb stood before the jury and thanked them for their attention. He reminded them that their duty was to follow the evidence wherever it led. And the evidence led to one inescapable conclusion. Ivy Vale had murdered her mother, her father, and her little brother. She had done it deliberately. She had done it with planning. And she had done it without remorse. The weekend recess gave everyone time to breathe. The prosecution was confident. The defense was worried. The media filled hours of airtime analyzing what had been presented. Legal experts debated whether the defense had any realistic chance. Most agreed the evidence was devastating. Some thought the youth of the defendant might create sympathy. Others thought her flat demeanor had destroyed any sympathy she might have earned. The only people who mattered now were the 12 jurors, and they were sequestered in a hotel, forbidden from watching the coverage. Ivy spent the weekend in detention. She had been allowed to attend trial each day, but returned to custody each night. The staff noted that her behavior had not changed. She was still quiet, still watchful, still controlled. She showed no anxiety about the case. She showed no fear about the outcome. She simply existed in her cell, reading books, writing in her notebook, waiting for Monday when the trial would resume, waiting to see what the defense would offer, waiting to learn her fate. Catherine Price stood before the jury on Monday morning. She knew the odds were against her. She knew the evidence was overwhelming, but she also knew that her job was not to prove innocence. Her job was to create doubt, to humanize her client, to remind the jury that they were judging a child, not an adult. She had spent months preparing for this moment. Everything depended on what happened next. She began by acknowledging the tragedy. 3 people were dead. A family had been destroyed. Nothing she said would bring them back. The prosecution had presented evidence that was difficult to hear, evidence that painted a disturbing picture. But evidence required interpretation. Evidence required context. And the prosecution had presented only one interpretation. The defense would present another. Ivy Vale was 15 years old. Her brain was not fully developed. Scientific research showed that the adolescent brain differed fundamentally from the adult brain. The prefrontal cortex, responsible for judgment and impulse control, was not fully mature until the mid-20s. Teenagers made decisions differently than adults. They processed risk differently. They responded to emotion differently. They could not be held to adult standards of culpability because they did not possess adult capacity for reasoning. This was not a legal loophole. It was scientific fact. A fact that the Supreme Court had recognized in multiple decisions limiting punishment for juvenile offenders. Fact that the American Medical Association and American Psychological Association had affirmed. Fact that meant Ivy Vale, however terrible her actions, could not be viewed through the same lens as an adult criminal. She was a child, a broken child, a child who needed help. The defense called their first witness. Dr. Michelle Tanner had evaluated Ivy extensively. She had reviewed her academic history, her medical records, her social development. She had conducted psychological testing over multiple sessions. Her conclusions differed sharply from the prosecution's expert. She believed Ivy was suffering from severe emotional dysregulation, that her capacity for empathy had been damaged by factors beyond her control. That her actions reflected a brain in crisis, not a mind-calculating murder. Dr. Tanner explained adolescent brain development in accessible terms. She used diagrams and studies and research from major universities. She described how teenagers processed threat and reward differently than adults, how they were more susceptible to influence from peers and outside forces, how their ability to foresee consequences was genuinely impaired by biology. Ivy's behavior made more sense when viewed through this lens, not as calculated evil, but as catastrophic breakdown. The prosecution cross-examined aggressively. Marcus Webb asked whether Ivy understood right from wrong. Dr. Tanner said she did in the abstract. Webb asked whether Ivy understood that killing was wrong. Dr. Tanner said yes. And Webb asked whether Ivy took steps to avoid detection after the murders. Dr. Tanner said yes. Webb asked whether those steps showed understanding of consequences. Dr. Tanner hesitated. She said understanding was different from fully processing. Webb pressed harder. He suggested that Ivy's actions showed exactly the kind of planning and reasoning the defense claimed she lacked. Dr. Tanner disagreed, but her hesitation had been noticed. The jury had seen it. The defense called witnesses who knew Ivy personally. Teachers who remembered her as bright and engaged before something changed. Coaches who had seen her talent and dedication. Neighbors who had watched her grow up and could not reconcile the girl they knew with the crimes she was accused of committing. Each witness offered a fragment of the person Ivy had been before. Someone with potential. Someone who might have been saved if the right intervention had come at the right time. A guidance counselor testified about warning signs she had reported. Changes in behavior, withdrawal from activities, declining grades. She had recommended evaluation. She had suggested family counseling. Her recommendations had not been followed. The defense implied that the system had failed Ivy, that adults who should have helped her had not acted quickly enough, that she had been left to spiral without support until spiraling became violence. The mysterious J became a focus of the defense strategy. Catherine Price argued that Ivy had been groomed by an unknown predator, someone who had exploited her vulnerabilities, someone who had encouraged her darkest thoughts, and someone who had manipulated a vulnerable teenager into committing acts she might never have committed on her own. The messages showed an outside influence, an adult voice telling her that her family was the enemy, that she deserved to be free, that taking drastic action was justified. The prosecution objected to this characterization. They argued that Jay's identity had never been established, that the messages did not explicitly encourage violence, that blaming an unknown third party was a distraction from the defendant's own choices. Judge Blackwood allowed the defense to present their theory, but reminded the jury that theories were not evidence. They would need to weigh the defense's claims against what had actually been proven. Ivy's aunt took the stand. Helen Garcia was Elena's younger sister. She had taken Ivy in after the murders, believing her niece was a traumatized survivor. She had sat beside her during those first terrible days. She had held her hand at the memorial service. Then the evidence had emerged, and everything she believed had collapsed. Now she sat in the witness box trying to explain the inexplicable. Catherine Price asked her about Ivy's childhood. Helen described birthday parties and family vacations and a little girl who used to make cards for her aunt. She described holiday gatherings where Ivy played with her cousins. She described a close family that loved each other deeply. Whatever had happened, Helen did not believe Ivy had always been this way. Something had changed. Something had broken. And the question was whether that break could ever be healed. The prosecution's cross-examination was gentle but pointed. Marcus Webb asked whether Helen had seen signs of the violence to come. She admitted she had not. He asked whether Ivy had ever expressed hatred toward her family in Helen's presence. She said no. He asked whether Ivy had seemed capable of murder before that night. She said no. The point was clear. Whatever theories the defense offered about grooming and brain development, the reality was simpler. Ivy Vale had hidden her true self from everyone who knew her. She had worn a mask so effectively that even family could not see what lay beneath. The defense's final witness was Ivy herself. Catherine Price had debated this decision for weeks. Putting a defendant on the stand was always risky, but the jury needed to see Ivy as human. They needed to hear her voice. They needed something beyond the flat expression and empty eyes they had observed throughout the trial. If Ivy could show remorse or vulnerability or anything that looked like genuine emotion, the defense might create the doubt they needed. Ivy walked to the witness stand slowly. She was dressed in a simple blouse and dark pants. Her hair was pulled back. She looked young. She looked small. She looked like the child the defense wanted the jury to see. Catherine Price began with gentle questions. Tell us about yourself. Tell us about your family. Tell us what your life was like before that night. Ivy spoke softly. She described a childhood that sounded almost idyllic. Loving parents, a little brother she adored, a home filled with books and music and laughter. She described her father's dedication to justice, her mother's endless patience, Noah's curiosity about everything. She described family dinners and weekend trips and the feeling of being safe. Her voice cracked slightly. Her eyes grew wet. The jury watched intently. Was this real? Was this another performance? They could not tell. Catherine Price moved carefully toward the difficult questions. Something changed in the months before that night. What happened? Ivy took a breath. She said she did not know. She said something dark had started growing inside her. Thoughts she could not control, feelings that scared her. She said she tried to ignore them, tried to push them away, but they kept getting stronger. She said she felt like two people living in one body, the person her family knew and the person who thought terrible things. She talked about Jay, someone she had met online, someone who seemed to understand her, someone who told her the thoughts were normal, that everyone felt that way, that her family was holding her back. She said Jay made her feel less alone, made her feel like her anger was justified. She did not know who Jay really was. She had trusted someone she should never have trusted, and that trust had led her somewhere she could not escape. Marcus Webb's cross-examination was brutal. He showed her the search history. Did you search how to remove gunshot residue? Yes. Did you search how police investigate home invasions? Yes. Did you search whether minors can receive life sentences? Yes. He showed her the photographs. Did you take a picture of your father's gun safe? Yes. Did you take a picture of the basement window? Yes. Did you take pictures of your own home like you were planning a crime? She hesitated. The word yes came out barely audible. He showed her the timeline. You shot your mother at approximately 12:18. You shot your father at approximately 12:25. You shot your brother at approximately 12:32. Then you spent 16 minutes staging the scene before calling for help. Is that correct? Ivy's composure finally cracked. Tears streamed down her face. She said she did not remember clearly. She said everything was a blur. She said she must have done those things, but she did not feel like herself. She said it was like watching someone else control her body. Webb pressed harder. You do not remember shooting your 9-year-old brother as he slept. Ivy sobbed. She said no. She said the memory was not there. She said something in her mind had blocked it out. Webb asked whether she expected the jury to believe that. The defense objected. The judge sustained. But the damage was done. The jury had seen the evidence. The jury had heard the non-answers. The jury had watched a defendant claim not to remember killing a child in his bed. The defense rested. Both sides had presented everything they had. The evidence was complete. The testimony was finished. All that remained were closing arguments and jury deliberation. Catherine Price hoped she had created enough doubt, enough sympathy, enough humanity to save her client from the harshest sentence. Marcus Webb was confident the evidence spoke for itself. The truth was clear. The only question was whether the jury would have the courage to act on it. The closing arguments began on a Thursday morning. The courtroom was silent. Every seat was filled. Our cameras recorded from designated positions. The whole country was watching. This was the moment when both sides would distill weeks of testimony into final pleas. This was the moment when the story would be told one last time, and the jury would decide which version to believe. Marcus Webb rose first. He walked slowly to the podium. He set down a single sheet of notes. He looked at the jury for a long moment before speaking. Then he began. This case is about 3 people who are not in this courtroom. Elena Vale, who made everyone feel welcome. Adrienne Vale, who dedicated his life to justice. Noah Vale, who was 9 years old and loved dinosaurs. They cannot speak for themselves. They cannot tell you what happened on that night. They cannot point to the person who took their lives. But the evidence speaks for them. The evidence points to that person, and the evidence demands accountability. He walked through the case methodically. The camera footage showing no intruder, the search history showing months of planning, the text messages showing motive, the gunshot residue showing participation, the timeline showing staging, the lies showing consciousness of guilt. Each piece connected to the next. Each piece reinforced the others. Together they formed a picture so clear that doubt became impossible. The defense asks you to see a broken child, but what the evidence shows is a calculating mind. She researched how to commit this crime. She researched how to avoid detection. She took photographs of her target. She sent messages announcing her intent. She executed her plan with precision. She staged the scene with care. She performed for police with rehearsed tears. This is not the behavior of someone whose brain could not process consequences. This is the behavior of someone who understood consequences perfectly and believed she could escape them. He paused. He looked at Ivy sitting motionless at the defense table. She did not meet his eyes. The defense blames an unknown influence, someone called Jay who supposedly groomed her into violence. But where is Jay? Who is Jay? We do not know because the defense cannot tell us. They offer a phantom to explain away choices. But Ivy made these choices. Ivy opened the safe. Ivy took the gun. Ivy pulled the trigger 3 times. Ivy staged the scene. Ivy called 911 with a false story. No one forced her hand. No one controlled her mind. She decided. She acted. She killed. He returned to the victims. He described Elena's final moments, crawling toward the door, reaching for help that would never come. He described Adrienne's final moments, looking at his daughter, trying to understand, failing. He described Noah's final moments. There were no final moments for Noah. He never woke up. He never knew what was happening. He died believing he was safe. He died believing his sister loved him. Marcus Webb's voice dropped low. A 9-year-old boy went to sleep one night with a dinosaur blanket and a nightlight and a stuffed animal. He trusted his family, he trusted his home, he trusted his sister, and his sister walked into his room while he slept and ended his life. There is no defense for that. There is no explanation that makes that acceptable. There is only accountability. Justice for Noah. Justice for his parents. A justice for a family that deserved to live. He concluded simply, "You have seen the evidence. You have heard the testimony. You know what happened in that house. The defendant planned these murders. The defendant committed these murders. The defendant tried to escape justice by blaming a phantom intruder. Do not let her succeed. Do your duty. Find her guilty. Give this family the justice they deserve." Catherine Price rose for the defense. Her task was harder. The evidence was overwhelming. The emotions were running high. She needed to shift the jury's focus from what Ivy had done to who Ivy was. She needed to make them see a child worth saving. She needed to create doubt, not about the facts, but about the appropriate response. She began with brain science. She reminded the jury about adolescent development, about the prefrontal cortex, and about the differences between teenage minds and adult minds. She cited the Supreme Court decisions limiting juvenile punishment. She cited the research showing that teenagers could change, that rehabilitation was possible, that condemning a 15-year-old to spend her entire life in prison meant giving up on the possibility of redemption. She acknowledged the tragedy. She acknowledged the evidence. She did not try to claim Ivy was innocent. That ship had sailed. Instead, she focused on context, on the factors that had shaped Ivy into someone capable of this act, on the grooming by an unknown predator, on the warning signs that adults had missed, on the mental health crisis that had gone untreated. Ivy was responsible for her actions, but she was also a victim of circumstances that a child could not have controlled. She described Ivy's childhood, the pressure of being a judge's daughter, the expectation of perfection, the fear of disappointing parents who seemed impossible to please. She described the isolation that came with privilege, the loneliness of being watched and judged and never truly known. She described a girl who had learned to wear masks so early that she forgot what her real face looked like, a girl who had lost herself long before she lost her family. She talked about the future. If you convict Ivy of first-degree murder, she faces life without parole. Life without parole means dying in prison. It means no chance for rehabilitation, no chance for redemption, no chance to become the person she might have been with proper help. It means giving up on a 15-year-old forever. It means deciding that a child can never change. Is that the justice system we want? Is that the message we want to send about our capacity for mercy? She looked at each juror in turn. I am not asking you to forget what happened. I am not asking you to pretend Ivy is blameless. I am asking you to remember that she is 15 years old. I am asking you to consider whether a child should be treated exactly like an adult. I am asking you to leave room for the possibility that somewhere inside the person you have seen in this courtroom there is someone worth saving, someone who with treatment and time might find her way back to humanity. She concluded quietly. The prosecution has proven what Ivy did. They have not proven who Ivy is or who she might become. Only time can prove that. Only mercy can give her that time. I ask you to find her guilty of a lesser charge. I ask you to give her a sentence that allows for growth. I ask you to show that our justice system can see beyond the worst moment of a person's life. Thank you. The jury received their instructions from Judge Blackwood. She explained the charges. First-degree murder required premeditation. Second-degree murder required intent but not planning. Manslaughter required reckless disregard for life. They could convict on any charge supported by the evidence. They could convict on different charges for different victims. They needed to reach unanimous agreement on each count. The jury filed out at 2 p.m. They began deliberating in a small conference room with uncomfortable chairs and a long table and all the evidence they had seen over the past weeks. 12 ordinary people tasked with an extraordinary decision. Some believed Ivy was guilty of first-degree murder. Some wondered whether her age required a different verdict. All of them felt the weight of what they were deciding. The hours passed. Thursday evening came and went. No verdict. Friday morning came. Still deliberating. Friday afternoon. No word. The weekend approached. Judge Blackwood sent the jury home with instructions not to discuss the case. They would resume Monday morning. The waiting was agony for everyone, for the families, for the attorneys, for Ivy herself, for a town that wanted closure and did not know how much longer it would have to wait. Monday morning arrived gray and cold. The jury had deliberated for 16 hours over 3 days. They had requested transcripts of certain testimony. They had asked for clarification on the legal definitions. They had sent notes suggesting disagreement and notes suggesting progress. No one knew what was happening behind those closed doors. Everyone was exhausted from waiting. At 10:47, the buzzer sounded. The jury had reached a verdict. The courtroom filled quickly. Reporters claimed their seats. Family members filed in. Ivy was brought from the holding area. She looked smaller than she had at the start of trial. The weeks had taken something from her, or perhaps the mask was finally slipping. Perhaps she was finally allowing herself to feel what was coming. The jury filed in. They did not look at the defendant. This was often a sign. When jurors avoided eye contact, it usually meant conviction. When they looked at the defendant, it usually meant acquittal. Catherine Price noticed. Her stomach tightened. She reached over and squeezed Ivy's hand. Ivy did not squeeze back. Judge Blackwood asked whether the jury had reached a verdict. The foreperson stood. A middle-aged woman named Sandra Chen, who worked as an accountant. She held a piece of paper in her hands. Her voice was steady when she spoke. On count 1, murder in the first degree of Elena Vale. We find the defendant guilty. A gasp went through the courtroom. Elena's family began to cry. Adrienne's brother lowered his head. The word hung in the air. Guilty. On count 2, murder in the first degree of Adrienne Vale. We find the defendant guilty. Another gasp. More tears. The second victim acknowledged. The second conviction recorded. On count 3, murder in the first degree of Noah Vale. We find the defendant guilty. The room seemed to contract. Noah, the 9-year-old boy, murdered in his bed. Guilty, first degree, premeditated. The jury had found that Ivy planned to kill her little brother, that she walked into his room knowing what she would do, that she pulled the trigger with intent and forethought. There was no mercy in that verdict, no room for doubt, only the cold acknowledgement of what the evidence had proven. On count 4, filing a false police report, guilty. On count 5, tampering with evidence, guilty. Sandra Chen sat down. The verdicts were recorded. The jury was thanked and dismissed. They filed out without looking back. 16 hours of deliberation had led to this moment. 5 guilty verdicts. First-degree murder on all 3 counts, the most serious possible findings. Ivy showed no visible reaction. She stared straight ahead. Her hands were folded in her lap. Whatever she was feeling remained locked behind the expression she had worn throughout the trial. Catherine Price put her arm around her client's shoulders. She whispered something no one else could hear. Ivy did not respond. Marcus Webb stood at the prosecution table. His face showed no triumph, only weariness. He had sought justice and obtained it. But there was no joy in convicting a 15-year-old of murdering her family. There was only the grim satisfaction of duty fulfilled. He would recommend the maximum sentence. He would argue that Ivy Vale deserved to spend her life in prison. But he would take no pleasure in it. The sentencing phase would come later. Judge Blackwood scheduled it for 2 weeks from that day. Both sides would have time to prepare. The prosecution would present victim impact statements and argue for the harshest penalty. The defense would present mitigation evidence and plead for leniency. The judge would make the final decision. In Mississippi, juveniles convicted of first-degree murder could receive life without parole after an individualized sentencing hearing that considered their youth. The Supreme Court required such hearings. It did not prohibit the ultimate punishment. Outside the courthouse, the reaction was swift. News crews broadcast live as the verdicts were announced. Social media exploded with commentary. Some celebrated justice for the Vale family. Others mourned the destruction of a young life, regardless of what she had done. The debate that had raged throughout the trial continued. Was this justice or vengeance, accountability or cruelty? The answer depended on who you asked. Elena's sister, Helen Garcia, gave a brief statement. She thanked the jury for their service. She thanked the prosecution for their dedication. She said her family finally had the truth, even if the truth was unbearable. She said she hoped the sentencing would bring closure. Then she walked away without taking questions. There was nothing more to say. Her sister and brother-in-law and nephew were gone. No verdict would bring them back. Inside the detention center that night, Ivy was placed on suicide watch. Standard procedure after a guilty verdict in a capital case. She did not resist. She did not protest. She simply allowed herself to be moved to a cell with a camera and a guard posted outside. She lay on the thin mattress and stared at the ceiling. The mask had served her for years. It had protected her from consequences and judgment and the expectations of others. But the mask could not protect her anymore. The mask had finally failed. The next 2 weeks passed slowly. The prosecution prepared their sentencing arguments. They gathered statements from family members who wanted to speak. They compiled evidence of the crime's impact on the community. They researched precedents for juvenile life sentences. They built their case for the maximum penalty. The defense prepared their mitigation case. They gathered evidence of Ivy's potential for rehabilitation. They brought in experts on adolescent development and juvenile justice. They compiled records showing her intelligence and capability. They prepared arguments about the possibility of change. They built their case for mercy. Ivy spent the days in detention. She met with her attorneys. She met with psychiatrists. She wrote letters she never sent. She read books from the detention library. She waited. The girl who had always been in control had finally lost control completely. The girl who had planned everything had run out of plans. All she could do now was wait for judgment. The sentencing hearing began with voices from the dead. Not literally, but the victim impact statements brought Elena and Adrienne and Noah back to life in the only way still possible. Through the memories of those who loved them, through the words of those left behind, through the grief that would never fully heal. Helen Garcia spoke first, Elena's sister. She walked to the podium slowly. She carried a folder, but did not open it. She had memorized what she wanted to say. She had been preparing for weeks, for months, for the rest of her life. My sister was the kindest person I ever knew. She remembered every birthday, every anniversary, every small moment that mattered to the people around her. She volunteered at the school library because she believed every child deserved access to books. She organized charity drives because she believed in helping those less fortunate. She baked casseroles for new mothers because she remembered how hard those first weeks were. She was not just my sister. She was my best friend, and she was taken from me by someone she loved more than her own life. Helen described growing up with Elena, the shared bedroom, the whispered secrets, the fights that never lasted more than an hour. She described watching Elena become a mother, the joy she took in her children, the patience she showed even when patience was hard. She described the last conversation they had, a phone call the day before the murders. Elena was worried about Ivy. She was talking about getting help. She believed her daughter could still be saved. She died believing that. She died reaching for the door, reaching for the stairs, reaching for her children, She died because her daughter decided her life was an obstacle. That is what I cannot understand. That is what I will never understand. How someone could look at Elena and see an enemy. How someone could take all that love and all that patience and repay it with a bullet. Helen paused. She looked at Ivy sitting at the defense table. Their eyes met briefly. Then Helen looked away. I do not know what justice means anymore. I know my sister is gone. I know her husband is gone. I know her son is gone. I know the person who took them is sitting in this courtroom. I know she was 15 years old. I know she was failed by systems that should have helped her. But I also know she made a choice. She chose to open that safe. She chose to pick up that gun. She chose to walk through her own home and end 3 lives. Those were choices, and choices have consequences. Helen sat down. The courtroom was silent except for quiet crying. The weight of loss filled the room like smoke. Adrienne's brother James spoke next. He was a tall man with gray hair and Adrienne's same serious eyes. He had driven from Memphis for the trial. He had sat in the gallery every day. He had watched the evidence and the testimony and the performance of his niece with an expression of total incomprehension. Adrienne was the best of us. He graduated top of his class. He could have gone anywhere, made any kind of money, lived any kind of life. But he came home. He came back to Belmere because he believed in public service. He believed in justice. He believed the law was how we kept our promises to each other. He spent 20 years on the bench trying to be fair, trying to see every side, trying to give people second chances when they deserved them. James described his brother as a father, the bedtime stories, the weekend trips, the patient explanations of how the world worked. He described Adrienne coaching Noah's Little League team, attending every one of Ivy's school events, working late but always making time for family dinner. He described a man who loved his children without reservation, who would have done anything to protect them, who died looking at the person he loved most in the world. The irony is not lost on me. Adrienne spent his life weighing evidence and handing down sentences. He believed in the system. He believed it worked. And now his daughter stands before that same system, waiting to learn her fate. I wonder what he would say. I wonder what sentence he would impose. I think he would be fair. I think he would consider her age, but I also think he would remember Noah. He would remember that little boy sleeping under his dinosaur blanket. And I think that memory would make it very hard to find mercy. Noah's teacher spoke next. Mrs. Patterson had taught 3rd grade for 22 years. She had watched hundreds of children pass through her classroom. But she remembered Noah clearly, the curious eyes, the eager questions, the hand that was always raised first. Noah wanted to know everything, and he asked about dinosaurs and planets and why the sky was blue, and he asked questions I did not know how to answer. He made me look things up so I could tell him the next day. He was the kind of student who made teaching worth it, the kind who reminded you why you chose this work. She described the last project Noah had completed, a poster about tyrannosaurs with handwritten facts and pictures cut from magazines. It was still hanging in the classroom when she learned what had happened. She had taken it down carefully. She had given it to Helen. She did not know what else to do. I do not understand how anyone could hurt a child like Noah. I do not understand how his own sister could do it. I only know that the world is smaller now. There is less wonder, less curiosity, less joy. Because a boy who asked beautiful questions will never ask another one. The victim impact portion lasted 3 hours. Family members, friends, colleagues, community members. Each one adding to the portrait of what had been lost. Each one reminding the court that behind the evidence and the legal arguments were real people, real lives, real grief that would last forever. When the statements concluded, Judge Blackwood called a recess. The courtroom emptied slowly. People hugged in the hallway. Some sat alone on benches, staring at nothing. The weight of the morning pressed down on everyone. Even the reporters looked shaken. Even the attorneys seemed drained. Loss like this could not be contained by procedure. It spilled over the edges and touched everyone it reached. Ivy remained at the defense table during the recess. She did not move. She did not speak. She had listened to 3 hours of grief and memory and accusation. She had heard her mother described as kind, her father described as just, her brother described as curious. She had heard the people who loved them explain what had been taken. And still she showed nothing. Still she sat motionless behind the mask she could not remove. Catherine Price sat beside her. She did not try to comfort. She did not offer reassurance. There was nothing to say. The mitigation evidence would come next. The arguments for mercy. The plea for a sentence less than life without parole. But after what the court had just heard, those arguments felt almost futile. How do you ask for mercy after so much grief? How do you argue for redemption after so much loss? Catherine did not know. She only knew she had to try. The afternoon session began with the defense's mitigation evidence. Catherine Price had assembled experts and witnesses who would argue for a sentence less than life without parole. She had prepared carefully. She had anticipated objections. She knew the odds were against her. But the law required an individualized sentencing hearing for juveniles. The law required consideration of youth and its mitigating qualities. She would make the court consider everything the prosecution wanted to ignore. Dr. Michelle Tanner returned to the stand, the defense psychiatrist who had evaluated Ivy months earlier. She had continued her assessment since the verdict. She had new observations to share. She had conclusions that might matter. Ivy Vale presents a complex clinical picture. She shows signs of conduct disorder with callous and unemotional traits. She shows evidence of attachment disturbance and emotional dysregulation. She also shows significant intellectual capacity and potential for development. The question before this court is whether she is beyond redemption. Based on my evaluation, I do not believe she is. Dr. Tanner explained that adolescents with conduct disorder could improve with proper treatment, that callous traits in teenagers were not necessarily permanent, that the brain continued developing into the mid-20s, that interventions during this developmental window could produce significant change. She cited studies and outcomes and success stories. She painted a picture of possibility that the prosecution would work to destroy. I am not minimizing what Ivy did. 3 people are dead because of her actions. But the science tells us that teenagers are different from adults. Their brains process information differently. Their capacity for judgment is not fully formed, and their potential for change is greater than we often recognize. A sentence that eliminates any possibility of release eliminates any possibility of redemption. I would ask the court to consider whether that elimination is appropriate for a 15-year-old. The prosecution cross-examined sharply. Marcus Webb asked whether Dr. Tanner's optimism extended to all juvenile murderers. She admitted it did not. He asked whether some teenagers showed signs of permanent psychopathy. She admitted some did. He asked whether the callousness Ivy displayed was consistent with such permanent conditions. Doctor? Or Tanner said she could not rule it out definitively. The admission hung in the air. Even the defense expert could not promise Ivy would change. A juvenile justice advocate testified next. Dr. Elaine Morrison had spent decades studying youth incarceration and rehabilitation. She described the differences between adult and juvenile justice philosophies. Adult systems focused on punishment. Juvenile systems were designed for rehabilitation. When juveniles were sentenced as adults, that rehabilitative purpose was lost. When juveniles received life without parole, that loss became permanent. She cited statistics about juvenile lifers, about the recidivism rates of those eventually released, about the programs that had successfully rehabilitated young people convicted of serious crimes. She argued that 15-year-olds should not be written off regardless of what they had done, that society had an interest in preserving the possibility of redemption even when redemption seemed unlikely. Sentencing a 15-year-old to die in prison is a statement about who we are as a society. It says we have given up. It says we see no hope. It says children can be monsters beyond saving. I do not believe that is consistent with our values. I do not believe that is consistent with our understanding of adolescent development. I ask this court to leave room for the possibility that Ivy Vale might someday become someone different, someone better, someone worthy of a second chance. The prosecution countered with their own expert. Dr. Samuel Roth had evaluated Ivy for the state. He was less optimistic than Dr. Tanner. He described the planning that went into the murders, the staging, the deception, the lack of remorse. He said these patterns were consistent with deep characterological problems that were unlikely to resolve with treatment. I have evaluated hundreds of juvenile offenders. Some show genuine potential for change. Others show patterns that predict ongoing danger. Ivy Vale falls into the second category. Her crimes were not impulsive. They were calculated. Her response to those crimes has shown no authentic remorse. Her behavior suggests an individual who views others as objects to be manipulated. I would urge caution in extending mercy to someone who has shown so little capacity for it herself. The competing expert opinions created exactly the confusion Catherine Price had hoped to avoid. Two credentialed professionals with opposite conclusions. The judge would have to decide which one to believe. And given the evidence presented at trial, that decision seemed likely to favor the prosecution. Character witnesses testified about Ivy's potential. A former piano teacher who remembered a dedicated student. A childhood friend who remembered kindness before something changed. A coach who remembered talent and teamwork. Each witness offered a fragment of the person Ivy had been, the person she might become if given the chance, the person hiding somewhere beneath the mask, and the crime and the destruction. But the fragments felt insufficient against the weight of what she had done. How could piano lessons matter when 3 people were dead? How could childhood kindness matter when she had killed her own brother? The disconnect between the witness's memories and the crime itself only emphasized how far Ivy had fallen, how completely she had become someone unrecognizable. Catherine Price delivered her closing argument for sentencing. She did not minimize the crime. She did not excuse the behavior. She simply asked for proportion, for consideration of age, for acknowledgement that the law required individualized assessment. Ivy Vale is guilty of terrible crimes. The jury has spoken. Justice demands accountability. But justice also demands wisdom. Sentencing a 15-year-old to life without parole means deciding today that she can never change. That in 50 years, when she is 65 years old, she will still be too dangerous to release. We cannot know that. No one can know that. The science tells us teenagers can change. And the law tells us we must consider their youth. I ask this court to impose a serious sentence that reflects the gravity of these crimes. But I ask that it be a sentence that leaves some possibility for review, some possibility for growth, some possibility that Ivy might someday demonstrate the change the prosecution says is impossible. Marcus Webb responded for the prosecution. His argument was simpler. Elena Vale deserved justice. Adrienne Vale deserved justice. Noah Vale deserved justice. The appropriate sentence for someone who planned and executed the murder of 3 family members was the maximum the law allowed. The defense asks for mercy. But where was Ivy's mercy when she shot her mother in the kitchen? Where was her mercy when she shot her father in the hallway? Where was her mercy when she walked into her brother's room and pointed a gun at a sleeping child? She showed no mercy that night. She has shown no genuine remorse since. She has played a role throughout this trial, hoping her age would protect her. It should not. She made adult decisions. She committed adult crimes. She should face adult consequences. He concluded with Noah, always with Noah, the youngest victim, the most innocent, the one who could never understand what was happening. A 9-year-old boy went to sleep one night believing his family loved him. His sister came into his room while he slept. She stood over his bed. She had a choice. She could have stopped. She could have walked away. She could have spared him. She chose to pull the trigger instead. That choice deserves the maximum sentence this court can impose. Anything less is a betrayal of Noah's memory. Anything less tells the world that killing a child in his bed has an acceptable price. It does not. The only appropriate sentence is life without parole. The arguments concluded. Judge Blackwood announced she would take the matter under advisement. She would issue her ruling in 1 week. The court was adjourned. Everyone filed out into the gray afternoon. The waiting would begin again. The last waiting. And then judgment would finally come. The courtroom filled for the final time on a Friday morning. 1 week had passed since the sentencing arguments. 1 week of waiting and speculation and preparing for whatever would come. The gallery was packed, every seat claimed. Reporters lined the walls. Cameras were positioned for the announcement. The whole country was watching. Ivy was brought in wearing the same modest clothes she had worn throughout the trial. Her hair was pulled back. Her face showed nothing. The mask was firmly in place. Whatever she was feeling remained hidden. Whatever she feared remained concealed. She sat at the defense table and waited for the judge to speak. Judge Blackwood entered. Everyone rose. She took her seat and surveyed the courtroom. She had presided over difficult cases before, but nothing quite like this. A teenage defendant, a murdered family, a community demanding answers. She had spent the week reviewing evidence and precedent and her own conscience. She had reached a decision. Now she had to explain it. Before I announce the sentence, I want to address some of the issues raised in this case. The law requires me to consider the defendant's youth as a mitigating factor. I have done so. The Supreme Court has recognized that juveniles are constitutionally different from adults. Their brains are not fully developed. Their capacity for judgment is impaired. Their potential for rehabilitation is greater. These are not opinions. These are scientific facts that the law requires me to acknowledge. She paused. She looked at Ivy directly. I have also considered the nature of the crimes. Elena Vale was killed in her own kitchen. Adrienne Vale was killed in his own hallway. Noah Vale was killed in his own bed. These were not impulsive acts. They were planned, researched, executed with precision. The defendant knew what she was doing. She understood the wrongfulness of her actions. She took deliberate steps to avoid detection. She staged the crime scene. She lied to police. She maintained her deception for days until the evidence made it impossible. The judge described the competing expert opinions. The defense psychiatrist who saw potential for change. The prosecution psychiatrist who saw permanent danger. She acknowledged the difficulty of predicting future behavior. She acknowledged the uncertainty inherent in any sentencing decision. I cannot know who Ivy Vale will be in 20 years or 30 years or 50 years. No one can know that. The defense argues this uncertainty requires leaving room for release. The prosecution argues the severity of the crimes eliminates that possibility. Both positions have merit. But I am required to make a decision, and that decision must reflect not only the defendant's youth, but also the gravity of what she has done. She turned to the legal framework. Mississippi law allowed life without parole for juvenile murderers after an individualized hearing. The Supreme Court required such hearings, but did not prohibit the ultimate sentence. The question was whether this case warranted that most severe penalty. In making this determination, I have considered every factor the law requires: the defendant's age at the time of the offense, her family and home environment, her emotional maturity and development, the circumstances of the offense, her participation in the crimes, her potential for rehabilitation, the interests of society, and the impact on the victims and their families. She recited findings. Ivy had been 15 years old. She came from a stable home with loving parents. She showed no signs of abuse or neglect. She had above-average intelligence. She had access to resources and support. Nothing in her background explained or excused what she had done. She had chosen this path when other paths were available. She had planned this crime when other options existed. She had killed 3 people when walking away was possible. The circumstances of the offense are among the most troubling I have encountered in my career. This was not a crime of passion. This was not a momentary loss of control. This was a deliberate execution of 3 family members over a period of approximately 15 minutes. The defendant had multiple opportunities to stop, multiple opportunities to choose differently. She did not stop. She did not choose differently. She continued until everyone in her family was dead. The potential for rehabilitation was the central question. Dr. Tanner saw possibility. Doctor. And Roth saw danger. The judge had to decide which assessment deserved more weight. I have carefully reviewed the expert testimony on both sides. I note that even Dr. Tanner could not rule out the possibility that the defendant's callous traits are permanent. I note that the defendant has shown no authentic remorse throughout these proceedings. I note that her behavior since arrest has demonstrated sophisticated manipulation rather than genuine reflection. While I acknowledge that teenagers can change, I am not persuaded that this particular teenager has shown any meaningful capacity for change. She addressed the victims directly, Ilana and Adrienne and Noah. She spoke their names slowly. She honored their memories. She acknowledged the grief that would never fully heal. No sentence can restore what was lost, and no punishment can bring back the dead. The purpose of sentencing is to hold the offender accountable, to protect society, to provide some measure of closure for those left behind. I have weighed all these considerations. I have struggled with this decision, and I have reached a conclusion. The courtroom held its breath. Every eye was on Judge Blackwood. Every ear waited for the words that would determine Ivy Vale's future. On count 1, murder in the first degree of Elena Vale, I sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. A murmur ran through the courtroom. The first sentence. The maximum, life without parole. On count 2, murder in the first degree of Adrienne Vale. I sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This sentence to run consecutively. Another murmur. Another life sentence. Consecutive, not concurrent. Each victim honored separately. On count 3. Murder in the first degree of Noah Vale. I sentenced the defendant to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. This sentence to run consecutively. 3 life sentences, without parole, consecutive, the maximum possible punishment. The judge had shown no mercy. The judge had decided that Ivy Vale would die in prison. On count 4, filing a false police report. I sentenced the defendant to 5 years imprisonment. On count 5, tampering with evidence. I sentenced the defendant to 10 years imprisonment, these sentences to run concurrently with the life sentences. The total was academic. 3 consecutive life sentences without parole meant Ivy Vale would never be released. The additional years made no practical difference. She would enter prison as a teenager. She would die there as an old woman. Everything in between was just waiting. I want to address the defendant directly. Judge Blackwood looked at Ivy. The girl sat motionless. Her expression hadn't changed throughout the sentencing. She showed no reaction to the words that would define the rest of her life. You were given every advantage. Loving parents, a comfortable home, intelligence, opportunity. You chose to destroy it all. You chose to end 3 lives that trusted you. You chose to become something monstrous. I do not know if you will ever understand the magnitude of what you have done. I do not know if you will ever feel genuine remorse. But I hope someday you do. I hope someday the weight of your actions reaches you, because you will have many years to carry that weight. Many years to remember the family you destroyed. Many years to live with who you have become. She paused one final time. This court is adjourned. The gavel fell. The sound echoed through the silent courtroom. It was over. After months of investigation and trial and argument, it was finally over. Ivy Vale had been sentenced to die in prison for the murder of her family. Justice had been served, or vengeance, or something in between. The answer depended on who you asked. Helen Garcia wept in the gallery. James Vale put his arm around her. They had waited so long for this moment. They had sat through every day of trial. They had listened to every detail of how their family was destroyed. Now they had closure, or something that resembled closure. The grief would never end, but at least the legal process was complete. Ivy was led away by corrections officers. She did not look back at the courtroom. She did not look at the families in the gallery. She simply walked through the door and disappeared into the system that would hold her forever. The last glimpse anyone had was of her back. Slim shoulders, pulled back hair, the posture of someone who had finally stopped performing, someone who had finally reached the end of the act. The prison transport left Belmere the following Monday. Ivy Vale sat in the back of a secure van, handcuffs on her wrists, shackles on her ankles, a chain connecting everything. She was being transferred to the state facility where she would spend the rest of her life. The drive took 4 hours. She watched the countryside pass through tinted windows, fields and trees and small towns where people lived ordinary lives. Lives she would never have, futures she had erased. The facility was large and gray and surrounded by fences topped with wire. It looked exactly like what it was. A place designed to contain people society had given up on. A place where time moved slowly and hope died quickly. A place where a 15-year-old who had murdered her family would grow old and eventually stop being news and eventually stop being remembered. Processing took several hours. Photographs, fingerprints, medical examination, psychological intake, assignment to a housing unit, issue of uniforms, explanation of rules. By evening, Ivy was in her cell, a small room with a bed and a toilet and a sink and nothing else. The door locked behind her. The sound echoed like finality. She sat on the bed and stared at the wall. The wall was blank, gray concrete, no windows. No decoration, no connection to the world outside. This would be her view for the next 60 years. This would be her entire existence, a cell, a schedule, a life without meaning or hope or redemption. She had escaped the boarding school her parents wanted to send her to. She had escaped their control. But the escape had led here, to a smaller room with higher walls and no exit at all. The first weeks were hardest, the adjustment to routine, the constant noise, the other inmates who looked at her with curiosity or hostility or indifference. She kept to herself. She followed the rules. She attended the required programs and counseling sessions. She said the things she was supposed to say. She performed normalcy the same way she had performed grief and innocence. But this performance had no audience, no purpose, no end. Months passed, then years. The outside world moved on. Belmere healed slowly. The Vale house was sold. New owners moved in. They painted the walls and replaced the flooring and made it their own. They never mentioned what had happened there. Most of the neighbors never mentioned it either. The town found ways to forget, or at least to stop remembering so loudly. Helen Garcia kept photographs of her sister and brother-in-law and nephew on her mantle. She visited the cemetery every month. She planted flowers at the graves. She talked to them about her life, about the children she still had, about the passage of time that made everything softer and sharper at once. She never visited Ivy. She never wrote. She never wanted to see the face of the person who had taken everything from her. James Vale returned to Memphis. He went back to his law practice. He worked longer hours than before. He found refuge in work the way some people find refuge in substances. It was healthier, but it came from the same need. The need to not think. The need to fill every moment with something other than memory. He kept one photograph of Adrienne on his desk, his brother in judicial robes, smiling. The last image of a man who had believed in justice. The reporters moved on to other stories, other tragedies, other trials. The Vale case became a footnote in true crime compilations, a chapter in books about juvenile offenders, a case study in criminal psychology classes. Ivy's name faded from headlines, faded from public consciousness, faded into the general background noise of violence that modern society had learned to absorb. But Ivy did not fade. She continued to exist inside her cell, inside her schedule, inside the life without future that she had created for herself. She read books from the prison library. She completed her high school equivalency. She took college courses by correspondence. She filled her mind with information that would never be used, knowledge that would never lead anywhere, education for its own sake, because there was nothing else. She also thought. For the first time in her life, she had nothing but time to think. The mask that had protected her for so long began to feel different. Not like armor, but like weight. She started to see the people she had killed not as obstacles, but as people. Her mother, who had loved her desperately. Her father, who had tried to save her. Her brother, who had believed she hung the moon. They appeared in her dreams. They spoke to her in voices she had forgotten. They asked questions she could not answer. The remorse came slowly, not all at once, not dramatically, just a gradual accumulation of understanding that built year after year. She began to comprehend what she had destroyed, not just 3 lives, but all the lives those people would have touched. Her mother's future grandchildren, her father's future rulings, her brother's future discoveries, the ripples that spread outward from every human existence. All of it gone because she had decided one night that her convenience mattered more than their survival. She wrote letters she never sent. To her aunt, to her father's brother, to Noah's teacher. She apologized in words that felt inadequate because they were inadequate. Nothing she could say would matter. Nothing she could feel would change what she had done. But she felt it anyway, and the weight her father would have wanted her to carry, the weight that had finally found her. Years became decades. Ivy aged inside those walls. Her hair turned gray, her face lined with time. She became an old woman in a place where old women went to die. The guards who had processed her on arrival retired and were replaced. The inmates she had known were released or transferred or buried. The world outside changed in ways she only read about. New technologies, new presidents, new crises. None of it touched her. She remained frozen in the amber of her sentence. On her 60th birthday, she sat in her cell and thought about Noah. He would have been 54 years old. He might have had children, grandchildren. He might have become a scientist like he dreamed. He might have discovered something wonderful. Or he might have lived an ordinary, happy life full of small joys and minor disappointments and the gentle accumulation of years. She had taken all of it, every possibility, every future, every moment he would never have. She cried then, real tears, not performed tears, not calculated tears, just the simple grief of someone who finally understood what they had done. 45 years too late, but finally. The prison chaplain visited sometimes, an elderly woman with kind eyes who had been ministering to inmates for decades. She asked Ivy about her faith, about her regrets, about what she believed was waiting after death. Ivy did not have answers. She only had questions. Would her family be there? Would they forgive her? Would she be allowed to see them again? Or would death be just another form of separation, another punishment, between another door that led nowhere? She died on a Tuesday morning in November, 73 years old. 58 years after she had been sentenced. She was found in her bed during morning count. The medical examiner determined natural causes. Her heart had simply stopped. The body that had once been young enough to climb stairs and pull triggers had finally worn out. There was no funeral, no memorial service, no gathering of mourners. Her remains were cremated according to the standard procedure for inmates with no family to claim them. Helen Garcia had died 10 years earlier. James Vale had died 5 years before that. There was no one left who remembered Ivy as a child. No one who remembered the piano recitals and the school awards and the girl who had once shown promise. Her ashes were placed in a small container and stored in a facility basement alongside hundreds of others. Inmates who had died with no one to claim them. People who had lived and breathed and made choices and faced consequences. People whose stories had ended without resolution or redemption or meaning. But somewhere in Belmere, the story continued. The courthouse where Adrienne had presided still stood. His photograph hung in a hallway alongside other judges who had served the county. His legacy lived on in rulings that had shaped families and businesses and futures. Elena's legacy lived on in the children she had helped at the library, in the families she had supported, in the kindness she had shown that rippled outward in ways no one could trace. And Noah's legacy lived on, too, in the teacher who still remembered his curious questions, in the classmates who still remembered his enthusiasm, in the small ways that one life touches other lives, even when that life is cut short. He would have been 54 years old. He would have been wonderful. He would have made the world better simply by being in it. That is what Ivy Vale destroyed on the night she chose herself over everyone she claimed to love. Not just 3 lives, but all the futures those lives contained, all the possibilities, all the moments, all the love that would have been given and received and passed along. She destroyed a universe and replaced it with nothing. And nothing is what she received in return. The camera that caught her that night still exists. Harold Weston donated it to the County Historical Society. It sits in a display case alongside other artifacts from notable cases. Visitors sometimes stop and read the placard. They learn about the judge's daughter who murdered her family. They shake their heads. They move on to the next exhibit. The story becomes just another story. The lesson becomes just another lesson. And the dead remain dead while the living try to understand why. This is how justice works. Not perfectly, not cleanly, not in ways that satisfy everyone, but persistently, patiently. Eventually. Ivy Vale believed her family name would protect her. She believed her youth would shield her. She believed she was smarter than everyone else. She believed she could get away with murder. She was wrong about all of it. And the proof of her failure lives in every year she spent behind bars. Every moment she had to remember what she had done. Every night she went to sleep, knowing she would never be free. The smirk she wore in the beginning finally disappeared. The mask she had perfected finally cracked. The person she pretended to be finally gave way to the person she actually was. Someone broken. Someone lost. Someone who had destroyed everything good in her life and had nothing left but time. Time to remember Elena reaching for the door. Time to remember Adrienne looking at her in the hallway. Time to remember Noah sleeping under his dinosaur blanket. Time that stretched forward into decades of regret and backward into one terrible night when a 15-year-old girl made choices that could never be unmade. That is the story of Ivy Vale, daughter of a judge, murderer of her family, prisoner for life. She thought her father's legacy would protect her. Instead, it prosecuted her. She thought her mother's love would save her. Instead, it testified against her. She thought her brother's innocence would be forgotten. Instead, it condemned her. She thought she could outsmart justice. Justice simply waited. Justice always waits. And justice always wins in the end. The courthouse stands. The town endures. The families heal as much as they can. And somewhere in a basement facility, A small container holds the ashes of someone who once had everything and chose to destroy it all. No one visits, no one mourns, no one remembers. That is the true price of what she did. Not just imprisonment, not just years, but erasure, complete and final and permanent erasure from the memory of everyone who ever loved her. She wanted to escape her parents' control. She succeeded beyond her darkest imaginings. She escaped into nothing, and nothing is where she will stay forever. If you believe justice was served, make sure others see this story too. Subscribe now. Leave your thoughts below. And remember that no matter how carefully someone plans their escape from accountability, the truth has a way of finding them. It always does. It always will.